Let's face it, whether you're an adrenal-fueled passion machine or more stoic than a stoned glacier in your day-to-day, everyone gets a little aggy from time to time, and we've all lost it during the throes of a heated gaming session. Offline though, it's fine, you can brush off a boss until you've calmed down, but online, rage quitting can ruin the experience for everyone involved. It leaves teams unbalanced, causes a proper stinky attitude amongst the community, and let's be honest, makes you look like a f***ing little baby if you can't hack a loss every once in a while. Thankfully, some developers have systems in place to either punish or shame quitters in both multiplayer and single-player games. However, as with my failed run as a policeman, there are some developers who take no prisoners and dole out harsh beatings to those who dare try to cheat the system. With this in mind, I'm Jules, WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 harshest ways video games punish you for rage quitting. Number 10. Mortal Kombat's Quitality. Quitting in an online fighting game should be considered a cardinal sin, especially if it's a ranked match and you're up against somebody who's absolutely trouncing you. Sometimes, like a bukkake, you've got to take it on the chin. Whilst most titles figure out a way to punish these players though, Mortal Kombat thought of a way to absolutely humiliate them. Not only are there the regular penalties and threats of timed bans, but quitting players also have to suffer a brutal quitality. Instead of unceremoniously ending the round by fading to black, deserted matches still end in classic MK fashion with the quitting fighter's head spontaneously exploding. It's Mortal Kombat through and through, and while it's still annoying to be ditched, at least the remaining player gets to be showered in the brains of their cowardly opponent. Number 9. Rainbow Six Siege bans you from ranked and caps your XP. When Rainbow Six Siege first launched, much like an AA meeting hosted by Buckfast Wine, it had a real quitter problem. Being such a balanced team-based game, players abandoning the losing side would doom that team to an inevitable loss, robbing them of the chance to make an epic last-minute comeback. When the devs at Ubisoft introduced a ranked mode though, they also established some ground rules for players intentionally quitting and disconnecting. If they quit, players would face a 15-minute ban and even a block on earning the in-game currency in any mode. Oh, and your rank would also be lowered as well, meaning that much like my lovemaking, your momentary rage-filled decision would leave you with lasting scars. Now, this is all well and good, but Ubisoft clearly hadn't factored in that sometimes their servers were absolute garbage, and often disconnects would happen, resulting in players being penalized for their sin of not being able to play the game properly. You're welcome. Number 8. Dead by Daylight strips resources from players who only want to be the killer. In a game as tightly balanced as Dead by Daylight, where one player is cast as a vicious killer on the prowl for a team of 4 survivors, even one person leaving early can throw off the whole dynamic of a match. Consequently, the developers included a pretty rigorous penalty system for people who abandon ship, stripping them of 3 points that go towards their ranking, while also forfeiting any of the blood point currency they'd earned in the game to that point. If you quit as a survivor, you're hit even harder though, also losing all of the items and resources you had equipped for the match. The title never resorted to outright bans, and you're never restricted from playing altogether, but you'll be noticeably worse off the next time you try to jump into a match. It's harsh, but at least it punishes players who don't like the role they've been given, unlike the similar Friday the 13th, which lets its fan base off quite lightly for joining a match and then immediately leaving in the hopes of donning those stinky and very bloody overalls of Jason. Number 7. Persona 4 Arena makes sure everyone knows who the quitters are. A surprisingly brilliant fighting game spin-off, Persona 4 Arena thought of an excellent way to shame players who constantly disconnect from online matches. Instead of going down the path that most games do, punishing quitters with bans and penalties, Arena instead makes it so that other players know what type of fighter they're up against. If you bail on too many matches, eventually your name will turn red, marking you out as a player who has a tendency of, not seeing fights out to their finish. Consequently, when matching with other players online, there's a good chance that most good fighters will back out of a fight with somebody with a red name, resulting in the quitters being ostracized by most of the title's core player base. I'll learn 'em, eh? Number 6. Street Fighter V implements full-day bans after 3 strikes. Since Street Fighter V launched, Capcom has constantly tightened the noose on players who rage quit during online matches, getting more and more extreme with the punishments they decide to dole out. Now it's gotten to the point where the devs don't mess around or mince words, implementing an automated penalty system that immediately punishes serial quitters. Although you can disconnect from a game once or twice without suffering any real consequences in attempt to lessen the burden on people who genuinely lose connection during a fight, after leaving a match early for the 3rd time, players will be hit with a 24-hour online 10 ban and 1,000 league points deducted from their profile. Losing the league points is a major hit to your standing in the game, but it's the full day time out from the multiplayer that's the real kicker. God, 24 hours in this hellhole we call Newcastle. Ugh, I'm sorry to all involved. Number 5. Paladins puts players back into the same game they just quit. Paladins has a pretty robust system to counteract rage quitters, not even giving the players to manually leave a ranked game and dropping the ban hammer on players trying to disconnect with a hard reset. With the duration the ban lasts increasing with every indiscretion, even if you decide to leave at the start of a match, you'll be still hit with a ban, meaning that once you're in the game, you're stuck with it no matter what. However, the title doesn't only punish those leaving ranked matches, and in an attempt to discourage players from trying to quit casual games, the devs implemented a system that means even if you manage to disconnect from the game and join another match, you'll always be put back to the same one you deserted in the first place. Obviously though, quitters won't have the stats they ranked up before they left, meaning not only did they have to continue with the match, but they lose out on the progression they acquired up until that point. Nasty. Number 4. Animal Crossing's Mr. Rossetti tells you off for quitting without saving. I'm not sure why you'd ever rage quit in Animal Crossing, but if you ever find yourself angry enough, or let's face it, lazy enough to close the game without properly quitting out of everything, you'll be due a visit from a very particularly angry mole called Mr. Rossetti. Showing up the next time you boot up the game, the mole, who may or may not have ties with the mob, watch out, will meet you at your house and give you a stern ticking off, lecturing you for not saving before shutting everything down. Popping around for a short but aggressive lecture, a visit from Mr. Rossetti will be enough to make sure you don't get too hot-headed and turn off Animal Crossing before saving ever again. Number 3. For Honor punishes the many for the acts of the few. Although it didn't release with a system in place to punish quitters, Ubisoft's For Honor made up for it when they introduced a ridiculously harsh penalty system in a later update. Initially not being too out of the ordinary, the game warns the players attempting to quit that they'll be given a 10-minute ban if they decide to go through with it. However, this time restriction doesn't mean that you can just pop into another game until you're free again, as the timer only ticks down when you're logged into For Honor's menus. And let's face it, those menus are not engaging in the slightest. They're not even in my top 10 menus. Well, no, stop writing. I don't want to do a list on that. Stop writing. No, stop writing. Weirdly though, if a leader of a group decides to bail, all of their teammates get the same punishment as well. It's a tad extreme to say the least, and has probably ended more friendships than it's actually stopped people from quitting. Number 2. Overwatch has an unspoken quitting threshold. One of the most popular multiplayer games of the decade outside of your mum, there's my one per list quota, it would be an understatement to say that players take Overwatch matches quite seriously. And by that I mean if you make one single mistake, you're going to get your ears pounded by a group of strangers calling you the worst things imaginable. It's a fun game, right? And enough to make you want to quit. But don't do that. It turns out that the game analyzes the last 20 matches you've played and your completion to quit ratio. If it drops under half, then you'll get a 75% XP reduction for all future games until you get back in the positive. If you're a rageaholic, which actually doesn't make sense because you're not addicted to rage-a-hole, then you're going to make this process even harder, as if you quit again and again, you're only digging that hole even deeper. And number 1, Marvel vs. Capcom 3 restricts you to a server populated only by quitters. Marvel vs. Capcom 3 doesn't have the flashiest way of punishing players. There are no brain explosions to be found here, but it does have one of the harshest and most insidious penalty systems around. Because if you decide to puss out, then you'll be lumped with all the other players who decided to play hooky. That's right, an entire server built of those who quit, an Alcatraz of assholes who all spam and get pissy with each other. It's brilliant, a self-contained bubble in which they don't affect the main populace with their poison, but still get to rage quit on each other to their heart's content.
Sometimes video games let you get away with being a bad dude. A little Grand Theft Auto here, a little kleptomania there, but sometimes actions have consequences. The following video games were happy to let you make mistakes, be a bad dude, and treat other NPCs with disrespect, but they all drew the line at letting you get away with it. Double-crossing any of these characters was a one-way ticket to an outcome you'd probably rather avoid. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 video games that punish you for double-crossing characters. Number 10. Leave the Seagulls Alone, Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. It's always fairly entertaining when a game gives you the option of doing something scummy, only with the full intention of punishing you if you actually tried to do it. This is absolutely the case in Metal Gear Solid 2, where you can shoot innocent seagulls, but your girlfriend Rose will be extremely unhappy about it. She goes as far as to ring you and tell you to stop hurting innocent animals, calling you a monster. If you keep dropping birds out of the sky or doing other shady things like creeping around the girls' toilets or hitting on Emma, she'll get extremely angry with you and flat out refuse to save your game. Which is probably something you're gonna want to do, so you know, happy wife, happy life and all that. Number 9. Romancing everybody. Persona 5 Royal. Plenty of video games are happy to let you flirt your way through your roster of companions or squad mates with little to no regard to whether that's a relatively uncool thing to do. At least the majority of those games will give you some kind of consequence if you decide to date around, but nobody does it quite like Persona 5 Royal. Persona 5 Royal gives Joker a huge variety of options for romance, and while sadly neither Ryuji or Yusuke make the cut, there are 9 women who are all set to fall for your mysterious outsider charms. So if for some reason you aren't immediately choosing Makoto, you'll likely take a shine to somebody. Or you can be a bad dude and romance literally all of them, because apparently you have the time between being a high school student and a phantom thief. Doing so, however, will result in you being confronted by every character you've spent your 100+ hour game romancing. This all comes to a head on Valentine's Day, where you're forced to sit there and listen to how much you hurt every single one of their feelings, which you totally deserve. And not just because you hurt Makoto's feelings, which is quite frankly unforgivable. You'll get the chance to apologize, but if you fumble that one, the girls will beat you up to the tune of the game's stressful battle music, which is entertaining if relatively embarrassing for our boy. Sojiro does cover for you though, and your bond grows with him as a result, so that's a cute little bonus. Number 8. Being a crappy commander. Mass Effect 2. To really screw yourself over in Mass Effect 2, you're going to need to be the worst commander the galaxy has ever seen, but this list is all about being a scumbag who double-crosses characters, so let's get into it. Choosing unkind and renegade options regularly, especially in your companion's loyalty missions, can result in them being disloyal to you when you need them later on, or it will lead to their death late in the game. For example, if you ignore Miranda's loyalty mission, treat her unkindly, or don't keep her in the loop, she will die in the Priority Horizon mission. Similarly, failing to help Thane find his son, or throwing Tally's father under the bus during her loyalty mission, will result in them being disloyal to you for the rest of the game. Having any disloyal squad mates during the game's pivotal and easily fatal suicide mission can result in one or more of your companions dying. So if you've been a friend, you can expect to say some hard goodbyes at the end of this one. Or maybe some not so hard goodbyes, since it seems like you weren't that into them anyway. Number 7. Choosing Triss and Yennefer. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. Joker learned his hard lesson in his 100+ hour game in Persona 5 Royal, but if you want, you can sink a ton of time into stuffing up your relationships in The Witcher 3 if that's something you want to do. In your defense, Triss and Yennefer are both very cool and down very bad for Geralt, so you'd be forgiven for wondering if you can romance both and get away with it. Spoiler alert, you absolutely cannot. While there are plenty of other bangable characters in the game you can actually get away with spending an evening with, these two are not so up for sharing with one another. The quest It Takes 3 to Tango kicks off with both women asking you to come share a bottle of wine with them. Geralt, thinking for a moment that he can in fact have it all, is advanced upon by the two women before they simply take the wine, leave him chained to the bed, and tell him off about being super shady. As if that wasn't bad enough, neither of the two women will want anything to do with you after all this, so there goes Geralt's big romance. Number 6. The Gun Trap Consequences. Until Dawn. Supermassive horror smash hit Until Dawn lets you kill or save all your characters depending on your choices and skill. Those aren't the only factors that will result in life or death situations though. There's also a fluctuating relationship mechanic where characters can grow closer or further apart depending on how you have them interact with one another. As you can imagine, you don't really want to be on the outs with anybody in a game where literally everyone can die, and your life might actually end up in another character's hands, and this is exactly what happens between Chris and Ashley. These two have a friendship and a bit of a will they won't they thing going on, but if you decide to have them constantly throw each other under the bus and treat each other poorly, you're going to regret it. In Chapter 6, the two are captured by the Psycho, strapped to chairs, and Chris is forced to shoot either himself or Ashley. If you aim your gun at Ashley and pull the trigger, she's understandably not impressed. While the two survive after that, Chris's fate in Chapter 8 will depend on whether you're in her good books. If not, she refuses to open the door for Chris when he arrives back at the lodge, leaving him out in the cold to be Wendigo chum. You get what you give, I guess. Number 5. Fighting Without Honor. Bushido Blade. While mowing down dudes in Grand Theft Auto or taking out 8 Sith at once with a well-timed Force Storm attack in Knights of the Old Republic, it can feel like video games don't really care about being honorable when it comes to taking lives. Not so in the case of Bushido Blade though, as the 1997 fighting game puts an emphasis on upholding the code of Bushido, requiring you to fight with politeness, benevolence, and decency. In the game's story mode, striking an opponent while their back is turned, doing something like throwing sand in their eyes, or attacking while they're bowing at the beginning of a match will have a huge negative impact on you. If you regularly fight dishonorably, the game will actually end abruptly with a message telling you off for your actions. It's hard to think of a punishment more brutal than a game that refuses to let you play it anymore, so let this be a lesson. Some video games will even let you have it for being unfair to the bad guys. Number 4, being a bad dog owner, Haunting Ground. It's generally understood that every video game dog is a good boy, even the ones programmed to try and munch on your ankles. So it stands to reason that we should treat them all nicely, especially if they aren't trying to obliterate our health bar. In Capcom's 2005 survival horror Haunting Ground, you're lucky enough to be accompanied by Huey, who will sit alongside you, attack your enemies, and follow your instructions. The white German Shepherd isn't just loyal and cute though, he's also clever. If trained correctly, Huey can be more effective at finding items, do extra damage to enemies, and be a sneaky quiet boy when you need to hide. If you're a horrible person though, you might decide to berate Huey and abuse him, in which case he'll get really sad and the game will set you on a path to the worst ending, where Huey doesn't save you in the final confrontation and instead attacks you, and protagonist Fiona ends up in a glass box, having been captured by the steward of the castle, Ricardo. And given you have to be really awful to Huey in order to actually get this outcome, it's a little hard to feel sorry for you. Number 3, shooting Lewis, Resident Evil 4. As is the case in Haunting Ground, it's nice to have a friend by your side when dealing with the ghoulish or undead beasties of a survival horror game, which is why usually you wouldn't want to treat them badly or shoot them. At least not shoot them 3 times, because everybody's got to draw the line somewhere. In Resident Evil 4, you're accompanied by Luis Serra, a man who used to work for Osman Sadler, the leader of Los Illuminados. He helps you out in protecting the president's daughter Ashley for a short while when the two of you become trapped in a cabin that's beset by baddies. If you decide to turn your gun on Lewis, he'll put up with it exactly twice before a cutscene rolls where he says, "Adios, Leon," aims his revolver at your head and shoots Leon dead. Which, like so many entries on this list, is super fair enough. Number 2, Not So Peaceful Monks, Tomb Raider 2. This one is an oldie but a goodie. Back in 1997, Tomb Raider 2 brought you action-adventure goodness, Lara's puzzling polygonal form, and a brutal punishment for killing innocent peaceful monks. At one point, you find yourself in the idyllic Barkang Monastery, inhabited by Tibetan monks. And at some point, if you find yourself thinking, what if I just started killing people? Well, here's what had happened to you. That wondering would quickly backfire on you, because while Taylor Swift says karma is a cat, clearly in Tomb Raider 2, karma is a battalion of warrior monks who are none too pleased you've decided to start attacking them. While you might be able to take on 1 or 2, if you aggro one of these guys, you'll aggro all of them, and there's no way to get them to chill out once you've decided to break the peace with them. Basically, expect to end up very dead here and begin reassessing your life choices. Number 1, Bad Master Chief, Halo Combat Evolved. As quintessential video game heroes go, Master Chief from Halo is pretty darn high on the list. That's probably why if you decide to play him like a crazed murderer, Halo Combat Evolved will come down on you before you even have a chance to pop the gun down and explain yourself. In the very first mission, the Pillar of Autumn, you can technically kill off one of your squad mates. But if you do so, the bridge will go into lockdown and invincible Marines will sink bullets into you until you've well and truly paid for your actions. As you might have guessed, there's no way to win this encounter because you really shouldn't have done it in the first place. Developer Bungie even ensured that if you somehow managed to escape the bridge after doing this, you'd be teleported back to it and you'd face that inevitable death that you probably deserved.
Considering how addictive video games can be, the reality of various primary colored explosions locking you into a gameplay loop that just demands one more game, it's a given that you really should keep moving to get the most out of the experience. Stop, and it's something that developers can very rarely factor in. In fact, almost as a reminder to not avert your eyes for 1 second, I'm Scott from WhatCulture.com, and these are 8 video games that punish you for doing nothing. Number 8, Bloodborne. More often than not in From Software's games, NPC questlines feature a make or break moment that can either win that character's favour completely or scupper your progress for the entire save file. The story of Eileen the Crow then is particularly hard to get right, especially if you're underleveled and not totally at home with the game's combat. Your second encounter with her is outside Odin Chapel, where she'll warn you of an old hunter Henrik who's gone mad. She tells you where not to go to find him, saying she can handle him herself. But Eileen is an old woman by this point, and any fight she gets into without you stepping in to help will just result in her death. Still, from the upper ledge of the Odin tomb, you might prefer to just watch. This is a Soulsborne game after all, and dying would only make you wish you'd stayed still instead. Do this though, and old Eileen won't survive, keeling over and disappearing from your playthrough altogether. Worse still, if you just avoided this encounter entirely, it dooms Eileen to later turn to madness and you'll end up fighting her directly instead. Either way, you really should just get involved. Number 7. The Oregon Trail. Anyone who's played this popular text adventure Oregon Trail will know that almost anything you choose to do can have disastrous consequences. Dysentery, cholera, drowning, these are just some of the ways the quaint little family on screen can meet their end on this cross-country trek. Throughout the game, the troop will have to make numerous stops, either to stock up on supplies, rest, or weigh up their options before crossing something like a perilous river. Each of these times you'll be given a passive option too, i.e. stopping to set up camp or waiting to see if conditions improve. This can also be your downfall though, as thieves can rob you in the night, and weather along the riverside can just get worse. If you then attempt to cross, it can seriously set you back in ways that you would have just avoided if you plodded ahead instead. Number 6. Diablo 2 Lord of Destruction. The gameplay of the first Diablo consists of a slow and increasingly haunting descent through the demon-infested Tristram Cathedral. Its dangers are very real, and many players got through these areas at a snail's pace compared to where something like Diablo 3 just goes. Diablo 2 is something of a middle ground, presenting vastly more open-ended environments and playstyles, and being far more frantic and action-packed as a result. This is shown to deliberate excess in the game-changing expansion pack Lord of Destruction. Your quest to kill the last of the 3 prime evils Baal takes you all the way up Mount Ariad until you reach the Worldstone Keep at its summit. This is where Baal resides, and you're gonna want to keep on your toes. Standing still for just a few moments will cause the Lord of Destruction to let out an evil laugh, then rain down a random elemental attack that wipes you out in seconds. It's a pretty interesting change-up to the Diablo formula, forcing you to stay on the move while simultaneously keeping on top of attack ranges and the best place to try and avoid harm. Number 5. Batman Arkham City. One of the ways in which Batman Arkham City built upon the series' critically lauded first installment Arkham Asylum was letting you play as Catwoman in her own standalone story. During these sections, Catwoman is on a mission to retrieve her stolen possessions from Two-Face, and try and rob him blind while she's at it. Once she reaches the vault, you're given the option to just leave Arkham City with the wad of cash you've picked up, or abandon it and head back in to save an ailing Batman. The right thing to do here is run to Bruce's aid, but if you choose to say, oh well, screw it, and wander out the door, the game does account for this and you'll get an early ending sequence instead. In it, Oracle cries out for help over the radio, noting her father Jim Gordon's death and Batman's too. Arkham City thankfully rewinds to the moment before you made this decision, because if you chose to do nothing, you just doomed the entire Arkham franchise. Number 3. Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. The most universally beloved of all the Metal Gear games, Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater is full of awesome frog-based secrets and crafty workarounds for you to exploit. But that's not to say that these things always work in your favor. One of the game's most memorable characters is the End, a 100-year-old at least sniper and one of the most skilled members of the legendary Cobra unit. He's fiercely dedicated to killing Naked Snake, able to wait for days at a time in one position just for the opportunity to hunt down his prey. The End's dying wish is for a good fight against Snake, letting you know just what you're getting yourself into. You'll naturally want to save at this point, and it's common knowledge these days that if you wait for a week of real-world time, or just change your system's clock, the End will then die of old age. Pretty cool, right? Well, it's a neat enough trick, but Snake is very much aware that he just robbed an old man of his dying wish. Thankfully, Snake doesn't get all melancholic if you blast the End with a rocket launcher from across the dock earlier on, but Hideo Kojima couldn't think of everything. Number 2. Animal Crossing. Gone are the days when you could boot up a light-hearted game, play for half an hour, then get on with the rest of your day. Now you're expected to be riveted 24/7, drinking in constant content packs and live events, or as the Animal Crossing games demonstrate, things can go very wrong. See, your town is the entire reason to care about any Animal Crossing game, from its inhabitants to the scenery to everything in between. You'll want to keep it in tip-top condition at all times, making sure to pull up the weeds and clear away any rubbish. This ensures everyone stays happy and contributes to how the game ranks or your customization too. What absolutely sucks then is if you go even a single day without playing. Your town will start being overrun with litter, unruly shrubbery and all sorts of other one-off bits and pieces that apparently only you have the power to pick up. On top of that, residents can full-on leave if things get too bad. I mean, hey, Isabel, maybe instead of coasting by on life being twee AF, you grab a trash spike and get to work. And number 1, Alien Isolation. Most survival horror games require you to be on the move at all times, with any number of things lurking in the shadows ready to pounce if you put a foot wrong. Alien Isolation is the perfect example of this, but with a continually evolving xenomorph, your tactics are never just as simple as running in the other direction. Like her mother before her, Amanda Ripley has next to nothing to fend this Xeno off with, meaning her most viable option is to keep the hell out of its way at all costs. Here is where the game gets a little divisive though, as Creative Assembly coded the alien to both know where you are at all times and then ignore that information. This twin brain setup routinely sees the knowledgeable side win though, and you'll be wrenched from a locker, under a table, or around a corner at a moment's notice. In a move that means Isolation is the best Alien game ever because you can never truly exhale and relax, constantly staying on your toes, it also means the reality of stopping to let the Xeno walk past will still see you torn to shreds every other time.
Some video game developers don't mind a bit of cheating, some in fact even encourage it. Cheat codes in games are primarily there to expand your enjoyment, causing all kinds of mischief with infinite ammo, god modes, big heads and the like. Others however aren't too fond of it and in fact will make sure you know they disapprove, sometimes in inventive and cruel ways. I'm Sai for WhatCulture.com and here are 8 ways video games punish you for breaking their rules. Number 8, Valkyrie Profile 2. A tactical RPG released for the PlayStation 2 in 2006, Valkyrie Profile 2 is notorious for its particularly punishing difficulty. Naturally, instead of trying to get good, several players tried to use cheat devices like Game Sharks to make things a little easier. Turns out, developers TriAce didn't just think of a way to counter said cheating, but instead decided to come up with one of the most savage punishments ever devised. If Valkyrie Profile 2 notices you're using a Game Shark, it will flag your save file, and attempting to use the save file will cause Valkyrie Profile 2 to crash. That's no big deal, you can just create a new save file and start again, or revert to a previous save file instead, right? Well, it turns out no, Valkyrie Profile 2 doesn't just flag the one save file, it flags every save file on your memory card, including the saves for other games. If you want to play the game again, you'll have to delete every single save file on your memory card, and even if you insert a new memory card, somehow Valkyrie Profile 2 will infect that too if you haven't deleted every save file on the previous memory card. It's so brutal it sounds illegal, and yet it happened. Number 7, SimCity. In the SimCity games, there are a few different cheat codes that allow you to get some free money and build expansive cities with little to no effort. Unbeknownst to most players though, several of the games have lots of different negative side effects that come with abusing these cheat codes too often. In the original SimCity, using the fund cheat code several times made it more likely that a disaster would strike your city and level your buildings. In the sequel SimCity 2000, the fund code was changed from a free cash injection to a loan with a whopping 25% rate of interest, which stacks every time you use the code. In the Windows 95 version, instead of giving you a loan or increasing the likelihood of disasters, it would immediately lead to a nuclear meltdown and destroy your city. A similar code, CAS, would give you money instead, and also result in a massive firestorm appearing out of nowhere. And just in case these punishments got you hot under the collar, if you wanted to type out a swear word out of anger in the direction of the game, all of your residential housing would be transformed into churches, which seems harmless until you realise that churches don't pay any tax. Number 6, Left 4 Dead 2. Left 4 Dead 2 introduced a new difficulty mode to the series, Realism Mode, which is designed to be extremely punishing and notoriously difficult to complete without the aid of other players. Much like in the original Left 4 Dead, however, there's a few different ways players can cheese the game to make things a little easier. One of the most common ways to cheat is to position yourself into certain places that stop the zombies from reaching you, letting you kill everything without getting touched. Except Left 4 Dead 2 found a way to counter players attempting to use the same exploits that were present in the previous game. If the AI director, the AI system in Left 4 Dead 2 that alters the challenge of the game on the fly, detects that you're positioned in a way that makes it impossible for you to be hit, it will spawn special infected that can reach you. This more often than not comes in the form of a smoker that will use its tongue to grab you from a high place, or a spitter which will snipe the player with corrosive acid that deals damage over time. You can run, but you absolutely can't hide. Number 4, Guild Wars. Cheating in Guild Wars is sheer lunacy in and of itself, as getting banned in an MMO is on a completely different level to getting banned in any other type of game. Tens or potentially hundreds of hours go into leveling a character in an MMO, which is a silly amount of time to render null and void by getting your account banned. Guild Wars decided to take this already upsetting punishment even further by adding a little salt into the wound in the form of a hitman named Doom. Should a player be dumb enough to cheat in Guild Wars, the in-game moderators will spawn in Doom to deal with them, an unkillable Grim Reaper who hunts down cheaters and bans their accounts with a swing of his scythe. Getting banned is obviously the main part of the punishment, but the added insult to injury here is that Doom is visible to all of the other players in the server. This means that should you be around anyone else when Doom eventually tracks you down, your punishment will turn into a spectator sport for everyone who witnesses it, making your death serve as a warning for every other player present. Number 3, Animal Crossing. In the GameCube release of Animal Crossing, players are able to travel to their friends' towns through the use of your town's train. Should you decide to, for whatever reason, reset or disconnect your game while visiting another town, there's a good chance you'll run into a rather spooky form of punishment in the form of Gyroid Face, named so by players for obvious reasons. Previously thought to be a bug but later proved to be an intentional form of punishment, Gyroid Face replaces your character's face with that of one of Animal Crossing's gyroids, as well as removing all of the items in your inventory at the time of resetting. Whilst it's unsettling in its own right to see your character's face replaced with that of a mask featuring empty hollow eyes and a blank void where your mouth used to reside, the lore behind gyroids makes it even spookier. Gyroids are based on Japanese hanawas, an item that was classically buried alongside the dead, implying that your character died when you reset. Considering this is a Nintendo game we're talking about, this is some creepypasta level stuff, although thankfully the punishment is temporary. Number 2, Jade Empire. Jade Empire, the often forgotten and sadly overlooked BioWare RPG from 2005, features a neat little gambling game. Should players take advantage of the gambling minigame that allows you to play dice against a character named Daoshin, they'll encounter a fun little surprise. As Jade Empire has a manual save system, players quickly discovered that by saving before playing against Daoshin, it's possible to win every game you play against him by simply reloading to a previous save file every time you lose. BioWare was clearly a few steps ahead of players, however, as should you miraculously win 20 games in a row against Daoshin, he will quite literally explode into several pieces and you'll no longer be able to play the dice minigame and earn some extra money. Should you be lucky enough to win 20 games without save scumming, Daoshin will explode regardless, which undoubtedly confused a few players who legitimately achieved this feat. Winning 19 matches and then intentionally losing once won't help either, as Daoshin will stop playing against you if you win more than 5,000 silver pieces from him, proving that BioWare put way more thought into this one gambling minigame than, say, I don't know, the entire ending of Mass Effect 3. And number 1, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. When The Witcher 3 first launched, it was often forgotten by its fans, a bit of a buggy mess. As CD Projekt Red was quick to iron out a lot of these issues, players looking to turn Geralt into an unstoppable killing machine were upset to find that an exploit for farming experience was patched out and replaced with a devious punishment. In the original version of the game, players found that a specific plot of land just outside of White Orchard allowed them to farm, and that is not a pun, cows infinitely by murdering them and then immediately meditating, causing them to respawn. This was a semi-decent way to get some easy experience, but it also allowed players to hoard their hides and sell them for a good profit. In patch 1.05, CD Projekt Red snuck in a countermeasure to punish players for farming said cows in the form of the Bovine Defense Force. After the patch, should Geralt kill a certain amount of cows in that same spot, an over-leveled chort will spawn, which would infinitely respawn should players manage to kill it. Hilariously, of course, players figured out that if they were a high enough level to defeat the chort, then this was also an easy way to experience. So a later patch made sure it was just one giant scary cow.
Due to the ever-expanding scope of video games, it is normal for players to be presented with enormous worlds to explore, and it makes sense that we'd get a little bit curious while in them. However, developers are tricky beings and often have an unwelcome surprise in store for us. With that in mind then, I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video games that punish you for being curious. Number 10, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, hiding the game's hardest boss in the first level. 2 words for you all out there: Ogdo Bogdo. This bloated croco frog monstrosity can be encountered pretty early on in Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, on the lavatory herb hybrid planet of Bogano. What players might not be aware of at this point in the game though is that you can actually leave planets and return to them later on when you're much stronger, so you don't need to defeat every boss that you find on your travels. And yet there's something so initially unassuming about Ogdo Bogdo that you just can't resist fighting him. I mean, after all, the lad's in a little cave that you can drop down into right near the start of the level, and the fight starts with zero fanfare. So you might be excused for thinking that it's just going to be a beefier regular enemy, and dive in with your big old laser sword to chop yourself off a slimy cutlet. Only Ogdo Bogdo will make you one with the Force faster than you can say Order 66. Curious players will inevitably be exploring the planet thoroughly and will have had no real challenge up until this point. So Big Oggy will come out of nowhere and hit you like a proton torpedo in your exhaust port. Smart players will then run to live another day, whilst defiant masochists, myself included, will just repeatedly fight Ogdo until they run out of swear words. Number 9, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Do not ring this bell. I suppose you should really expect a From Software game to never go easy on you. But when you encounter a mysterious bell in Sekiro, which reads, "Do not ring this bell," inviting misfortune is an act of virtue, but only the stoutest of hearts may consider it. Curiosity levels saturate to the point where even a FromSoft noob just can't resist to ring it. I mean, after all, if you see a big old bell out in the wild that says, "Do not ring it at all costs," wait, you're gonna ring it, aren't ya? Of course though, in this game, doing so immediately curses you. Like Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice wasn't tough enough already. Now enemies have damage resistance, increased posture resistance, and a bunch of additional buffs to make your katana about as lethal as a kitchen roll tube. In exchange, you get increased loot, sure, but that doesn't mean a thing if you only just barely beat that first troll dude on regular difficulty. In a further act of ignorant self-flagellation as well, if players refuse Kuro's gift at the beginning of the game, you'll make the title even harder. So yeah, next time you get a warning to not ring a big old demon bell, don't. Number 8, Monster Hunter World. High-level creatures roam near your target. As the saying goes, looks can be deceiving, and in Monster Hunter World, that goes double. As on your way to finding an elusive target beast, you might glimpse the sight of a different creature in the distance, one that doesn't look too tough. But the thing is, World has this tendency of occasionally letting absolute powerhouses just strut about the place, often temptingly close to your target monster, and you might think, hey, maybe I can get a twofer here and double my haul. Often, though, something far smaller can be just as potent as something much more evidently beefy, so getting dragged into a fight with what looks like easy prey can often be catastrophic. So yeah, word of advice, don't be tempted to pick a fight with something that isn't on your list. Number 7, Spelunky. The game kills you for playing too well. For a game with such a cheery aesthetic, Spelunky is anything but amicable with players. As a procedurally generated roguelike, it is expected that players will fail, but that's not to say that everyone will be prepared by the utter stress of the whole experience, as Spelunky is littered with snakes, spikes, spiders, and probably other things beginning with S, and every last one of them wants you to not be alive. The Spelunker of Spelunky, though, let's just call him Ian for argument's sake, has to descend ever deeper into a set of caves, get a bunch of diamonds and golden statues, and somehow escape alive. And if you manage to fight the swelling desire to see if you can make a clearly impossible jump or survive a pit of snakes with barely any weaponry, you might explore the current level long enough to be punished by an unstoppable ghost that only appears if you've taken too long on a level, often to investigate every nook and cranny for valuables. So once this event is triggered, Ian's only hope is to dash towards the exit, often making hasty mistakes in the process in order to survive. Number 6, Blasto, Do Not Press. Those of us who grew up with earlier generations of video gaming may recall a far simpler type of gameplay. That being, collect all the things, get to the flag, shoot all the flying red pixels. You know the kind I'm talking about. Levels themselves weren't so much levels as they were canvases that you could project your own imagination onto, and when your characters, bullets, and level geometry all looked like big identical green boxes, you kinda had to. As games progressed into 3D though, we still had a similar issue. Sure, you could explore levels in a new dimension, but the levels themselves were still sparse, often completely untextured spaces with the odd obstacle thrown in. This meant that objects in those worlds stood out like a sore thumb, such as the huge scant space in Blasto with a huge button in the center of it. And we all know the temptation of a button in a game like this, but if you should press it here, all of your controls will suddenly invert. And given that Blasto is already an unforgivingly tricky game to begin with, well, good luck with that. Number 5, Dark Souls. Some treasure chests will absolutely obliterate you. In video games, a chest almost always means a cash reward, a new suspiciously useful item, or a delightful meal that you can chow down on for extra buffs. That is, of course, with the exception of Dark Souls. See, Dark Souls revels in its killing of players, and because there are no shortage of ways to be slaughtered in the series, naturally players are always going to be on high alert. However, much like the Resident Evil save music stirs a Pavlovian response inside you telling you that you can finally relax, seeing a treasure chest always drops your guard, and you inevitably scuttle towards your payday like a kid towards an ice cream van. So in Dark Souls, you do this very same motion, you pry it open, but instead of getting a hookshot or $5,000, you get, well, dead. You just get dead. And that's because it's not a chest, but actually a monster, a mimic to be precise, and it loves curious, greedy little players who last saved the game 40 minutes ago. Number 4, Silent Hill 4 The Room, Leave the Doll Alone. It seems that there's a theme to most of the entries on this list. Usually it's a button you can't resist pressing, a room you can't resist entering, or an item you can't resist taking or interacting with. And the entry for Silent Hill 4 The Room is no different. Sitting on a dilapidated metal staircase coated in rust and full of melancholy, a character called Walter Sullivan at one point hands the player, Henry, a shabby doll, one of his sole possessions. Now, disorientated by the fact that, as the player, you've just been sucked through a hole in your apartment wall and are now being assailed by floating murder ghosts, this act of kindness is a rarity, and so you're probably going to embrace it. However, take the doll back home to your apartment, and before long, your living room will be haunted by numerous hidden baby faces piercing through the wallpaper, surrounding the doll and, well, just doing nothing positive for the overall decor. Unfortunately, as Henry can't just whack a poster over the top and pretend it doesn't exist like a bad landlord trying to hide some mold, he has to either exorcise the demons or just sit and regret why it felt like it was a good idea to take toys off a stranger in a hell dimension. Number 3, Overwatch. Any attempt to experiment with characters. When Overwatch was first released back in 2016, the idea of the hero shooter had kinda reached maximum popularity, and yet this game stood head and shoulders above the rest, due to the sheer quality of its presentation and the sheer cultural phenomenon that it became. With a mechanically diverse cast of characters and 4 distinct classes, those being support, tank, defense, and offense, players got to experience that one-time only joy of cycling through every hero, discovering their unique abilities, and deciding on which one suited their playstyle. And yet, as the game progressed, that cast appeared to shrink as the community got progressively less tolerant of particular character picks. See, if players were new to the game during this period of a settled meta, they'd miss out on getting to try out all of the characters as they were shepherded towards choosing the meta-only picks, something totally contrary to the spirit of the game. Arguably, Activision Blizzard have continued this limitation themselves with Overwatch 2, locking original characters behind first-time familiarization periods and new characters behind battle passes. So whereas before, curiosity was limited only by toxic teammates, now it's locked behind a paywall. Number 2, EVE Online, play perfectly or lose everything. The ignorant of us will walk into EVE Online thinking it'll be the spaceship RPG of their dreams. After all, EVE is super complex and allows for some unique career choices, but it also quickly spirals out of control, and soon you'll have like 3 Microsoft Excel spreadsheets open just to keep track of everything you're doing. Whether you're playing as a cop or as a smuggler or even just a transport ship, be prepared to invest a lot of time into the game. And that's because this is not No Man's Sky, Chorus, or even Elite Dangerous. Everything you do in EVE Online must be carefully considered, to a degree where you might consider it more akin to a micromanagement sim mixed with chess than a simple space exploration game. If you do decide that you want to take your maiden voyage off to a planet far, far away, for instance, you will almost certainly die from pirates flying into controlled space, so shot down by police or vigilantes, or just basic resource depletion. Everything that looks even remotely interesting in this game is likely heavily regulated by in-game laws, or wants to explode you into a million pieces. Number 1, Dead Rising, time is against you. Perhaps one of the Xbox 360's finest and most impressive titles, Dead Rising was the Dawn of the Dead game that we didn't know we needed. Playing as Frank West, players are trapped inside a shopping mall during a zombie invasion and must survive 3 increasingly in-game dangerous days as the situation gets more and more dire. What's particularly novel is that the player themselves is free to do as they please within this time limit, so can choose to spend their finite time saving survivors, finding the real scoop, or even just shooting zombies with Nerf darts for 3 days straight, stopping only to chug down several liters of orange juice. However, with a ticking clock and such a wealth of options, players might find themselves curious enough to diverge from their plan of action and get dragged, for instance, into a park bench duel with a cult leader in the mall cinema. What this inevitably means is overly curious players will lose track of time and miss out on some elapsed content. But that's also precisely why the temptation to explore is so irresistible. Later games sadly axe the timer entirely, and with it any real sense of urgency and objective management, which effectively just turned Dead Rising into Dynasty Warriors with zombies.
One of the greatest things about video games is the freedom that they grant you over other visual media, to let the story play out however you want and to explore gorgeous, teeming worlds lovingly brought to life by a committed team of artists. But in these 10 games, exploration was less a fun exercise in discovery than it was a chore, a frustration, and even an active detriment to the central gameplay loop. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video games that punish you for exploring. Number 10, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Given that Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order offered up 8 gorgeously rendered worlds for players to visit, it was a fair assumption that the game would incentivize exploration and discovery in a major way. The gameplay is heavily Metroidvania inspired, what with players being encouraged to revisit planets once they've acquired more force powers, in turn allowing them to reach new areas. As awesome as that sounds though, Jedi Fallen Order is a mess of contradictions, seeming to encourage players going off-piste but presenting itself in such frustrating and confusing fashion as to actually discourage it. For starters, the horrible holographic menus are a real chore to make sense of, which given the oft labyrinth-like nature of the game's worlds makes even the most basic navigation a real headache. Then there's the game's irksome checkpoint system, whereby resting at a meditation point to restore your health will also cause every enemy in the level to also respawn, meaning that it's often impossible to quickly run to a path that you wanted to check out. The lack of a fast travel makes exploration a chore as well, as there's no way to bypass the mundanity and just get to where you want to go without a bunch of hassle. Anyone hoping to hoover up the game's many collectibles is in especially dire straits, unaided by the fact that when you die, which you will often, you have to sit through some disappointingly long loading times even on newer hardware. All in all, it adds up to a game that just doesn't respect the player's time and in turn makes the prospect of exploration bafflingly unappealing. Number 9, Alien Isolation. Alien Isolation was rightly praised upon release for the impressively dynamic AI programming for the xenomorph that stalks players throughout the game. However, given how gorgeously reminiscent of the original film's ship, the Nostromo, the space station Sevastopol is, players couldn't be blamed for wanting to stop and smell the roses while traipsing around its halls, even with a terrifying alien creature on the loose. While the game absolutely presents itself as encouraging exploration of the station, this is in constant conflict with the game's AI design, because the longer you spend walking around aimlessly, the more opportunity the AI has to fling a xenomorph attack your way. If you keep moving, it becomes tougher for the game's adaptive AI to adjust to your tactics, but if you take it slow and explore every nook and cranny, it's just a matter of time before you get waylaid by the xenomorph. Hilariously, enough players have complained about this that a mod was eventually created by a fan allowing you to freely explore the station without the threat of the xenomorph at all, which is rather genius. Number 8. Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II is generally accepted to be one of the worst games in the series, and that's in large part due to a maddening gameplay loop that basically begs you to use a guide. The RPG's dungeons design is some of the most infuriating that you'll ever encounter in the genre, with pathways seemingly encouraging exploration only for them to turn up dead ends full of nothing but utter tedium. Now, while it isn't reasonable to expect every part of every dungeon to be air quotes meaningful, Final Fantasy II takes the winding, convoluted dungeon trope to the length of self-parody. Further compounding the frustration is the higher encounter rate, and the many trapdoors that will throw you into a room just full of tough enemies. The refinements made in the recent Pixel remaster reduce the irritation factor somewhat, but this is still some of the most listless and tortuously dull dungeon design in the genre's history. Seriously, unless you are a tireless purist who has to get the job done without any outside help, use a guide or a map to navigate these dungeons, for the love of God. Number 6. Metro Exodus. The Metro franchise is first and foremost centered around survival, but considering how impressively detailed the post-apocalyptic world that you're presented with is, the desire to explore is completely undeniable. And yet, Metro Exodus in particular feels like it's primed to punish those who take detours from the main story path, largely because the subsequent encounters will often put you at a greater disadvantage moving forward. Ammo and general supplies are incredibly scarce throughout the game, and often the cost-benefit balance of exploring the wider world just simply isn't worth it. It's highly likely that you'll end up with less loot than before, so why even bother? In a game where resource management is key and a single mistake can get you killed, there's very little incentive to go anywhere that you don't need to, no matter how lovingly crafted the entire game world is. The trade-off for most players just simply isn't worth it. Number 5. Deus Ex Human Revolution. In the case of Deus Ex Human Revolution, this applies to one specific part of the game, its opening level, Back in the Saddle. You're tasked with exiting Sarif Industries HQ in order to take on a tense hostage situation, but the game first allows you to explore the office's lobby area if you so wish. There's a lot for players to look at and toy around with here, but those who spend more than 15 minutes tinkering will find that in their next mission, the aforementioned hostages have died. Now, while in fairness, the game does basically say you shouldn't stick around at the HQ for too long, to offer up such an interesting locale for players to explore and then immediately try to hurry them out the door is a total contradiction. Upon the game's release a decade ago, less attentive players even assumed the dead hostages were a bug, hilariously because they made more sense than IDOS presenting players with a neat area to explore while paradoxically telling them to rush to the helipad. Sure, you can return to the lobby later on in the game, but it's not like that we know that when the game starts or are acutely aware of the grave outcome our lollygagging will cause. Number 4. Skies of Arcadia. Though classic Dreamcast RPG Skies of Arcadia has a fond place in many people's hearts, there's absolutely no denying that its overabundance of random encounters absolutely discourages players from exploring its beautiful open world. While the GameCube port Skies of Arcadia Legends nerfed the encounter rate, the original Dreamcast release is an absolute nightmarish avalanche of constant random battles. Given the world's inviting qualities, it's infuriating that you're so often held at arm's length from it by these battles, which are further elongated by both needlessly drawn-out, unskippable animations and a lack of auto-battle options. For a game supposedly to be about the joy of navigating your way through a gorgeous world, its overactive random battles absolutely contradict that. Number 3. Far Cry 4. Now, this really applies to most of the more recent entries into the Far Cry franchise, but perhaps none more so than the 4th game. There are few things more immersion-breaking in open-world games than a large on-screen notification explaining that you're about to leave the combat or mission area. Far Cry 4 had some especially strict parameters for its air quotes mission zone, such that venturing even remotely off the beaten path would see your precious immersion totally shattered with an obnoxious warning message. While you may end up accidentally leaving the shockingly narrow mission zone because you stumbled across a point of interest, it's also entirely possible for the AI enemies to lead you astray. In extreme cases, you're not even able to use your sniper rifle because the required distance to operate the scope properly is outside of the damn mission zone. Obviously, it's important that open world games promote freedom, as is their entire appeal, and if a game's going to micromanage the player's movements so aggressively and outright fail them if they disobey the rules, then it probably shouldn't be an open world game at all, right? Number 2. Shadow of the Colossus. Exploring Shadow of the Colossus' rich, mysterious world is an absolute joy, though players who endeavour to reach the game's secret garden will find a rather nasty surprise waiting for them. To even consider reaching the garden, you'll first need to have your stamina effectively maxed out, which requires beating the game once and then twice more on New Game Plus. On your 4th playthrough, you'll now have enough stamina to climb a wall of moss outside the central shrine, which will let you reach the secret garden. In the garden, you'll see trees bearing bountiful-looking fruit, and though shooting down one and eating it will pop you the Fruit of the Garden trophy, it will also poison you. While fruit eaten in any other area of the game will slightly boost Wanda's maximum health, all of the fruit in the secret garden is poisonous and will decrease both your health and stamina considerably. That's quite the way to de-incentivize exploration in a game with such a lush, expansive world, right? And number 1, Life is Strange Before the Storm. And so our list concludes with a slightly sillier but no less punishing example from the Life is Strange prequel Before the Storm. In the game's very first episode, players are able to explore the bedroom of Chloe's mother Joyce, and upon opening one of her bedside drawers will be greeted with a decent collection of condom wrappers, some unopened, while others being torn open with clear lustful enthusiasm. Given that neither Chloe nor the player particularly wants to picture Joyce getting down to business with Chloe's stepfather David, the mere glimpse of the condoms is sure to send a nauseated shiver down everyone's spines. On the one hand, this is what you get for snooping around your mother's bedroom. Parents are people too, after all. But on the other hand, developers Deck 9 clearly knew that they'd leave players gagging with this discovery. Lesson learned. Now please, pass the brain bleach.
For those who have the dedication, there's no feat more impressive than getting 100% completion rate in a video game. And so that's why it's particularly disappointing when you put in the time and effort, only to discover there's no pot of gold at the end of that rainbow. Just an enormous waste of your own time. For whatever reason, the developers of the following games decided that instead of rewarding you for your efforts, they'd make you wonder why you even bothered. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 9 video games that punished you for 100%. Number 9. Maxing out ring capacity. Sonic Frontiers. For as long as there has been a speedy blue hedgehog who needs to move quickly, there has been the incentive to pick up gold rings, and 2022 Sonic Frontiers is no different. Except that it is a little different, because while you'll be given the opportunity to increase your ring capacity, you really shouldn't. That's because the game will prompt you to invest in either increasing your speed or your ring capacity, and increasing your ring capacity will only up the ring cap, which you should be ideally sitting at as long as possible in the game. When you are at the maximum ring cap, you unlock a cutscene where you power up, meaning you'll move and dash faster. If it's not already clear, you're gonna want that. Of course, that's harder to achieve the higher your ring cap is, so while it might be tempting to invest in ring capacity as this makes Sonic more able to withstand damage, you're actively working against yourself for the main aim of the game, which is, of course, speed. If you actually got your ring capacity to 100%, you'd make it extremely difficult for yourself to hit the ring cap, thereby missing out on that all-important speed boost. Luckily, if you've spec'd entirely into ring capacity and realized all of this too late, there is the option to swap points out later, so you'll be good to go. Number 8. You can stop now. Blast Core. That last entry was pretty involved, but not to worry, this one is short and sweet. If you think a game telling you that you've played more than enough of it and you should stop playing it is a badge of honor, then you'll have been appreciative of this one. For the rest of us, it was not so great. Rare's classic action game for the N64 was a hit when it arrived on the console in 1997, and has retained a fond spot in the memory of many gamers. Potentially not the gamers who managed to get every platinum though, as this was not an easy game at all. Rare have said the game was designed to be almost impossible to platinum across the board. But of course, where there's a way, there are gamers who are capable of it. I hope getting all 57 platinum medals in the game was worth it for the love of the game, because you don't get anything special for accomplishing this Herculean feat. In fact, all you get is a brand new rank called You Can Stop Now. That's actually what it's called. If you had a great time and you were aiming for this one, it might not feel like a punishment, but for those who had to grind for it only to realize the game is basically saying, hey, go do literally anything else, you might have felt a little insulted. Number 7, a very cool use of your time. Castlevania Aria of Sorrow. If you've ever played a Castlevania game, then you already know trying to get 100% in one of these iconic experiences is no joke. Symphony of the Night might have thrown you for a loop when you thought you finished the whole game and then realized you needed to go through the much trickier upside-down version of the same castle, but at least that's essentially the second half of the game. Nope, Aria of Sorrow and its 100% requirement to collect every soul is much more demanding and much more punishing on the crappy reward side. Even with the Soul Eater ring, which increases the appearance rate of souls and all the skill in the world, this challenge is still an absolute grind and requires some very kind RNG. So what do you get for this monumental time and effort undertaking? Well, you get your main character saying he's cool. Not even joking. If you cross off all the same things, you'll get the exact same ending and visuals, except Soma says the experience did change him because, and I quote, I'm a lot cooler now. If it's any consolation, Mina totally agrees, but then one screen later, you're back to the exact same ending and text that you would have received if you didn't sink untold time into 100% soul collection. This is another I hope that completion screen is its own reward kind of entry. Number 6, the priciest dance party, LEGO Dimensions. For the uninitiated, LEGO Dimensions is a Toys to Life game, meaning you're gonna want to supplement the digital experience with real-life LEGO toys that you may or may not want. You can probably already guess that trying to 100% a game with this model is not only going to be time-consuming, but it's also going to be pretty expensive. Back when the game came out, it was estimated to cost north of $500 to buy every single character and item, depending on when you pick them up. For that investment, you'd expect that the completionist ending would be pretty darn great. Right, it is good, right? Because that's a lot of money. Oh, what? No, this is a list about games that punish you for time and effort. That's right, never mind. To get this ending, you'll have to collect over 480 gold bricks, at which point you unlock the Vorton Disc Red Brick, and are told to head back to the main game hub. While dancing in video games is often delightful to watch, even when Shepard is doing it, the 100% ending for LEGO Dimensions is a new option in the game menu called Dance Party. There are disco lights, some quotes from the main characters that you would have already heard in the main campaign, and any character you put on the toy pad will dance, almost all of which will do so with pretty much the same animation. Yeah, this is a rough one. Number 5, you're bad and should feel bad, Braid. Most people know that Jonathan Blow's 2008 puzzler Braid is not a game designed to make you feel like a hero. It's a game designed to trick you into thinking you're the hero before you realize you're actually the villain. But of course you won't get to that point until the very end. With some insanely precise platforming and puzzling know-how, you may be able to collect all the hidden stars in the game, granting you 100% completion and an alternate ending. And if you think there's a chance this is going to make you feel better about the game's regular downer ending, you are very, very mistaken. Whether you think protagonist Tim is simply stalking the princess, or the game is a metaphor for the creation of the atomic bomb, or the ending is a commentary on obsession leading to destruction and an overall judgment of you for even playing, it's not particularly heroic. The alternate ending lets you finish the constellation, which shows a woman in chains, and when you touch the princess, she explodes. So, there's that. Well done, you. Number 4, have a relaxing vacation, Super Mario Sunshine. An infamous but unavoidable entry if we're talking about video games that punish you for getting 100% is, of course, Super Mario Sunshine. Collect all 120 shine sprites scattered across the game world, and to congratulate you for proving mastery of the game's systems and completing all that it has to offer, you're granted an alternate ending. Now, this probably wasn't intended to troll you, but the ending is so infamous that clearly enough players felt miffed that Nintendo thought this was an acceptable trade for the incredible amount of time these dedicated completionists put into the game. Instead of the standard ending, you'll get a photo of Mario and the gang standing around over the top of the text that says, "Have a relaxing vacation." Exactly what vacation this might be, we can't be sure. A vacation from your slim hope that getting 100% in the new Mario game in 2002 was going to grant you with a cool ending, perhaps. Number 3, mocked by Jeff Goldblum, The Lost World, Jurassic Park. Right up there with the things you don't want to hear after sinking a monumental time into hitting 100% in a video game are the following. Turn the thing off for heaven's sake and go outside. Breathe the air, take a walk, call a member of the opposite sex. You have a whole life out there. Get the stink blown off you. Just go. Now, cushioning the blow of that particular set of sentences is the fact that they're said to you by Jeff Goldblum at the end of The Lost World Jurassic Park. But it's still essentially you getting 100% in the game just for him to tell you to touch grass, so that kind of sucks. Some of you will disagree and absolutely love this ending, and for that, I totally understand. But let's be clear, in order to be told you're a loser by Jeff Goldblum, you have to collect all the DNA bonuses for each character, which is incredibly tricky because this game is bloody difficult. Whether you like this ending or not, this one absolutely pulled a blast core and told you that you can and should stop now. Number 2, Crap, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Have we talked about this one on What Culture lists before? Yes, we have. Is it so funny and relevant to this particular list that I couldn't help myself but include it? Absolutely. Collecting Korok seeds in Breath of the Wild is totally worth it throughout the entire game, because you'll get to expand the size of your inventory, which is a huge help. Collecting all of them, though, is a huge and punishing exercise in futility, because the grand reward for collecting all 900 of them is Hetsu's gift, which sounds fine. Until you find out Hetsu's gift is literal crap. The Korok puzzles can be agonizingly difficult, and even using a guide is super tricky, because, again, there are 900 of the little buggers. And what do you get for your trouble? A bad-smelling gift of friendship that does nothing. Potentially admirable as the ultimate troll, but absolutely a punishment of your time investment. Number 1. A car you don't need. Ni no Kuni: Wrath of the White Witch. This is a really particularly cruel reward for hitting 100%, because it's actually something you'd really like to have earlier in the game, but at the point you'll be at once you can actually obtain it, it's completely useless. In Ni no Kuni, once you complete the entire game, you'll be able to access Errand 131, where a rabbit asks you to kill off stronger versions of all the bosses you've fought before in the game. Head back to your rabbit pal, the conductor, and he'll give you a new set of boss bounties to eliminate. Rinse and repeat with all of these bosses until you have to kill off the Guardian of Worlds, which, if the name doesn't give it away, is gonna take you a hot minute. The rabbit then zaps you to Motor City and he gives you a car that you can use to get all around the game map, the very same game map you've thoroughly completed by this point because the game is over. The Filmobile 2000, as it's named, is also a kick in the teeth because it's the same bloody car you drove into a lake at the start of the game, which resulted in your mother's death. Awful. Just awful.
Whenever games include cheat codes, their primary purpose is to make the game easier for you. They're meant to make you feel overpowered and give you an experience quite unlike the regular game. That said, sometimes developers like to lay traps for the cheating part of their player base. You might have been expecting infinite lives, but instead you've come away with a spanked bottom, because I'm Sai for WhatCulture.com, and here are 10 video game cheat codes designed to punish you. Number 10, Risky Money, SimCity 4. Even to this day, SimCity 4 is considered one of the greatest city builders of all time. This isn't just because of the game's fantastic city creation tools, but also because the bizarre world was really endearing and captivating. Your city could be attacked by a giant robot or visited by aliens, and your Sims would tell you the most outrageous things. The weirdness of the game also extended to its cheat codes, with Risky Money being the best example of this. Remember how in The Sims typing motherlode would instantly grant you a huge load of cash? Well, Risky Money does a similar thing, except every time you use it, there's a slight chance a massive earthquake will destroy your city. Every time you want to get some easy and fast money through cheating, the game plays a little gamble with you. You might get a few extra grand in your treasury, but it might also cost you millions of simoleons in damages. The exact chance of the cheat causing an earthquake is 25%, and if these odds sound good to you, you might have what it takes to make it as a crooked politician. Number 9, I'm drunk as a skunk and twice as smelly, Red Dead Redemption. Getting drunk in video games is like getting drunk in real life, but without the painful experience of a hangover the very next day. There can be something inherently funny about your character struggling to perform even the simplest of tasks, although at the same time you can probably tell how annoying it would be if the effect didn't go away after a while. This is exactly what the cheat code I'm drunk as a skunk and twice as smelly from the original Red Dead Redemption does. After you input this long and convoluted phrase, which if you've ever used the PlayStation text input you know just how painful that is, the game will give your character a permanent buzz. Now, instead of just drunkenly waddling in front of the saloon, you can ride across the entire map and get into shootouts with people while seeing double and being unable to maintain maintain basic hand-eye coordination. The cheat was obviously made as a joke, but to be honest, it's also a great handicap for those who feel like Red Dead Redemption is just too easy. Well, you might have beaten Red Dead Redemption, but did you beat it as the cowboy equivalent of Jackie Chan's Drunken Master? Number 8, Skyfall, Grand Theft Auto 5. Taking flight in Grand Theft Auto 5 can be a pretty tricky endeavour unless you have access to Trevor's airstrip. Your only chance of flying high is to break into the highly secure airport or the highly secure military base. But what if there was an easier way to reach the skies in a matter of seconds, perhaps with a simple cheat code that you can input at any time? Well then, the cheat Skyfall is exactly what you're looking for. Activating it instantly teleports your character into the stratosphere, letting you freefall and fly around carelessly until you finally drop to the ground and die an absolutely gruesome and painful death. Although the code has some fun applications, it's mostly just a trap laid down for those who mess around with cheats with no clue what they're doing. If you didn't invest in a parachute prior to inputting these random codes, activating Skyfall will be a guaranteed death sentence. There is technically a way to survive the fall by head diving at the last second, but again, an oblivious cheater who uses the code for the first time will be too dumbfounded about being launched thousands of kilometers into the air to think of viable survival strategies. Number 7, the Serious Room, the Stanley Parable. Seeing as the Stanley Parable started off as a mod for Half-Life 2, it's obviously built on the Source engine and has access to all of the cheat commands that come with it. Except that's not entirely true, although you can activate the Source engine console in the Stanley Parable and even type some commands into it. Typing svcheats1 does not activate any cheats. Instead, it teleports you inside the infamous Serious Room. What is the Serious Room? Well, no need to ask, the game's narrator will tell you all about it as soon as you're transported inside, because this bleak, empty and poorly lit room is supposed to be your punishment for cheating. As you're stuck inside the Serious Room, the narrator will keep describing the seriousness of its interior to you while simultaneously chastising you for your poor ethics. You can't really do anything but listen to his unnecessarily elaborate monologue, and if you try to enable cheats again, you only risk distracting your captor and making his rant even more unhinged. But let's be honest, this is really only a punishment through the eyes of the narrator, because if you're playing the Stanley Parable, this is the kind of nonsense you signed up for. Number 6, Super Sabers, Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. The Star Wars Episode 3 video game features a great deal of lightsaber fighting with Jedi and Sith alike. The duels can be fairly challenging at times, and so you might feel like giving yourself a slight advantage by using a cheat code or two. That's when you come across a code called Super Sabers. It sounds like just the thing you were looking for, right? A Super Saber will surely obliterate anyone who crosses your path. But when you activate the cheat, nothing seems to change about your character or their lightsaber. Well, why? Because the code doesn't give you a Super Saber, it gives them to all of your enemies. Ridiculously long and wide lightsabers that take up half the screen and can snipe your character from across the room, all the while you're still your normal defenseless self. This is honestly such a huge betrayal of the player's trust that it makes Anakin's defection to the dark side look like complete amateur hour. Number 5, State of Emergency, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. Aside from your standard cheat codes for immortality and infinite ammunition, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas features a variety of nonsensical and downright masochistic commands. For example, there are some that make all pedestrians attack you on sight, and there are some that just kill your character instantly. However, for a truly harrowing and punishing experience, you want to use the code State of Emergency. This activates Riot Mode, turning the entire Los Santos area into a chaotic and utterly violent epicenter of civil unrest. Now, not only will pedestrians attack you on the spot, they'll also start gunfights, blow up cars, and commit all sorts of crimes that make it virtually impossible to walk down the street without something or someone being a danger to your health. It's basically like GTA Online, except without other players. The best part is that the Riot Mode applies to story missions as well, so if you thought following the train with Big Smoke was bad, try doing it while there's a slight possibility your bike might randomly explode, or your chase will be interrupted by a civilian ramming their car into you and your friend. Just another typical day in Grand Theft Auto. Number 4, Evil Cars, Saints Row 2. The cars in Saints Row 2 don't enjoy an easy life. If they're not getting stolen or beaten with a baseball bat, some crazy gangster, that is you, is probably driving them into a wall or straight towards the Stillwater River. Thankfully, the cars don't have to endure their abuse in silence. All it takes is one simple cheat code and a player dumb enough to use it, and the motorized day of reckoning can finally take place. The cheat code Evil Cars in Saints Row 2 turns every car and driver into a murderous homing missile. As soon as you enter it, your character will become a car magnet, and the game will change from a tale of a rowdy gang of saints into a survival horror where ravenous automobiles have overtaken the planet and are hunting down the last remaining human. The cars are truly relentless with the cheat code on, and they can jump at you out of nowhere and reach you in the least likely of places. It actually makes for an interesting challenge, but it should go without saying that attempting a normal playthrough of Saints Row 2 with this cheat code on is near impossible. Number 3, Grunty's Code Vengeance, Banjo-Kazooie. Losing your saved files is never a fun experience. This said, losing your data due to a glitch or corruption doesn't leave you nearly as betrayed as the game deliberately erasing it in order to punish you. For this reason, you might want to steer clear of Banjo-Kazooie's cheat codes. The Xbox version of the game doesn't take kindly to using them, and if you refuse to heed its warning, it won't hesitate to take your save file away from you. That's right, inputting more than 2 cheat codes in the secret code room in Treasure Trove Cove will result in Gruntilda the Witch cursing your game with a little save-o eraso. Your game data will be gone, and because the first cheat you input disables saving, you'll be forced to start your adventure all over again. To be fair, you do get a warning that the third cheat you use will take away your save, but it's still a pretty harsh punishment for someone just wanting to have a little bit of fun. Well, that's what happens when you mess with a grumpy witch. Number 2, Doom cheat codes, Heretic. The easiest way to describe Heretic is to call it a medieval version of Doom. The game shares a lot of similarities with the father of first-person shooters, including its HUD layout, gory graphics, and even its cheat codes. The famous id DQD and id KFA cheats from Doom that activate God mode and unlock all of the weapons in the game respectively are present in Heretic as well. The only difference is that in Heretic, these cheats don't make you an immortal one-man army. Instead, they make a pretty nasty joke at your expense. Using the God mode cheat will cause your character to explode into bloody little pieces, and the weapons cheat will rob you of all of your items as opposed to giving you new ones. Their opposite effect is clearly a reference to Doom, which makes sense considering some of the developers from id Software helped create Heretic. Still, it is pretty brutal to do something like this without any warning. Imagine the sheer humiliation of someone who tried to show off their cool immortality cheat to their friends and then got instantly turned into a pile of bloody goo. I guess that's karma for you. And number 1, the Konami code, Gradius 3. The Konami code is one of the most famous cheat codes in video game history. Ever since its introduction in Gradius, this specific sequence of commands, known as the Konami code, has been a staple of most of Konami's titles, providing players with bonuses and secret features as long as they know how to enter it. Seeing as Gradius is what started it all, you'd think that each game in the series would make the rewards you get for entering the code especially amazing. Unfortunately, the prodigal son known as Gradius 3 would beg to differ. In the first Gradius, the code grants you an extra 30 lives. In the second Gradius, it gives you extra lives and every power-up if you activate it mid-game. And in Gradius 3, it makes your ship explode. Oh, you thought you were being smart by entering a universal code with a long tradition of helping people in this particular franchise? Well, Gradius 3 is just too cool for that kind of silly, childish hand-holding. Gradius 3 is the family's annoying, edgy kid brother who has to remind everyone that it has high enough difficulty level to sit at the grown-ups table.
The worst part about the video game industry is that it often burns the people who care about it the most. Publishers get the biggest fans to pay the most money for the most broken versions of games. They find ways to monetize their passion through DLC and so much more. But sometimes it can just feel like they're playing a cruel joke on you for daring to care at all. And with that in mind, I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 8 video games that punish you for caring. Number 8, Call of Duty Warzone 2. Activision has missed a lot of open goals in their time, but in recent memory they haven't fumbled the bag quite as much as they did with Warzone 2. After launching the massively popular Battle Royale shooter in March 2020, Call of Duty was bigger than ever, with regular support, an addictive gameplay loop, and BR mechanics that limited the slow item management that the genre is known for, and prioritized action. Warzone 1 was an instant hit. The only issue was that it had to accommodate the yearly COD release schedule, which meant that with the releases of Black Ops Cold War and Vanguard, all of the weapons from those games had to be added to Warzone, as well as new themed maps and skins to pair the progression of all the experiences. This, combined with the arrival of next-gen machines, meant Warzone became bloated and unwieldy, so Warzone 2.0 was announced, a clean slate and new game that would be built from the ground up to facilitate this kind of long-term support. With a new map, new weapons, and next-gen features, it seemed as though Warzone 2 couldn't fail. And then it came out. In many respects, this new version felt more of a prototype than the original game did. With a new inventory backpack system, slower gameplay, and less fun looting, this was a more classical BR experience, losing the immediacy that made the predecessor such a joy to pick up and play. Warzone 2 admittedly is improving and has rolled back many of these features, but at launch it felt like fans of the original Warzone were being punished for enjoying its unique approach to the genre, and were instead given this basic PUBG clone and told to like it or lump it. Number 7, The Avengers. Look, I'm not here to tell you that Marvel's The Avengers was a disappointing game. You already know that, I already know that. The finished version of the title is not what actually lands it on this list, it's how it was treated post-launch. See, the reason that it punished players for caring is that the people who actually enjoyed the game at launch and stuck with it, hoping their time would be rewarded, were all ultimately lumped with a post-release content roadmap that did not live up to its potential. Over the years, Square Enix added a bunch of new characters and stories to the game, yes, from Black Panther to the Winter Soldier, but they were few and far between. The missions they added were often paltry too, while pre-release promises like PlayStation's Spider-Man DLC and character were just bare bones and arrived late. Now, all of this might have been excusable. I mean, it's certainly better than nothing if Square Enix didn't also try to squeeze the fan base for every penny along the way. From increasing the grind just arbitrarily to charging obscene amounts of money for skins and other microtransactions, it felt as though the publisher was fleecing the few people who actually gave the game the benefit of the doubt. Number 6, Guitar Hero Live. Guitar Hero Live, I bet that's not a name you've heard of in a long time. Well, back when the PS4 and Xbox One were the fresh new consoles on the market, the gaming industry decided that it was time to reignite some dormant franchises. So both Guitar Hero and Rock Band came back and attempted to win over fans like they did back in the day, to differing degrees of success. Guitar Hero Live, though, while being divisive with its live-action concert presentation, did have a really cool idea. Rather than paying for individual tracks, it would instead keep things fresh by cycling between essentially different seasons of tracks. GHTV, as it was known, was designed around separate themed music channels that would add new songs regularly, allowing players to access them through, you guessed it, occasionally premium microtransactions. This feature added an insane number of songs to the game, but with it being a live service and all, it meant that they could be taken away at any moment. And when Guitar Hero Live bombed, Activision were quick to shut the servers down, which meant that players could only access the paltry 48 songs on disc, compared to the near 500 that were added to this live component. And because it didn't have regular song DLC where you bought and just downloaded it, it didn't matter if you had actually spent money to access those songs previously. Number 5, DMC Devil May Cry. When Capcom decided to reboot their beloved Devil May Cry series, they also chose to hand the reins over to a Western developer named Ninja Theory. There wasn't any real reason to get rid of the original developers, but at least Ninja Theory seemed like a safe pair of hands, having made the solid Heavenly Sword and beloved cult classic Enslaved Odyssey to the West. And for all of its faults, DMC is a great action game worthy of the series' name, but it's also something of a middle finger to series devotees. That's because this was a total reboot of the story and characters, with the beloved designs and personalities of the cool white-haired demon slayers Dante, Nero, and Virgil being, well, modernized. And these modernizations not only absolutely sucked the life out of the story, not helped by Dante now looking like a young Morrissey wannabe or something, but they also actively mocked the previous incarnations, with new Dante infamously quipping, "not in a million years," when donning a white wig evocative of the previous Dante's hairstyle. Again, DMC is a great action game, but this tone and approach made it clear that it wasn't a great Devil May Cry game, and burned fans who had invested in the franchise for so many years. Number 4, Mass Effect 3. Look, to be honest, there's no world where Mass Effect 3 doesn't end up being some degree of disappointing. BioWare set an extraordinarily high bar with Mass Effect 2, and the promise of all of your choices culminating in any number of ways for the final game was simply an unrealistic goal for the time. Hell, it's unrealistic now. But it's not just the ending that makes Mass Effect 3 disappointing, but a bunch of other changes that make it a slap in the face to people who made the RPG series such a success. And that's because it seemed as though EA and BioWare were embarrassed by the series' RPG roots in the first place. And so the depth was ripped out of this third game. Conversations now had a limited amount of dialogue options where sometimes Shepard would just speak without any input from the player at all. Character building was minimized, and side missions only really amounted to increasing a number that decided how many allies you'd have at the end of the game. I still think overall Mass Effect 3 is a good game, but it's certainly not a good RPG. And that's a real punishment for players who jumped in on game 1, expecting those RPG mechanics to only grow, not shrink, like they did. Number 3, Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain. In most senses, Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain is an amazing game, perhaps the best stealth action game of all time, no joke. From the large, well-crafted maps offering tons of creative freedom for players to complete objectives, to stealing equipment and personnel with the silly but satisfying full-time recovery system, and that killer soundtrack, it is a total dream to play. However, people weren't primarily playing MGS5 for its gameplay. No, they were playing because this was the last Metal Gear game, period. The finale in a decade-spanning franchise that, going off the trailers, promised to bring together the prequel timeline and the present-day timeline together and finally bridge that gap. And ultimately, that just isn't what the game is at all. Promised to be a missing link in the marketing, MGS5's story ultimately raised more questions than it answered, leaving fans feeling an overall lack of completion and cohesion, a phantom pain, if you will. However, you can't really blame the developers on this one though, as publisher Konami and game director Hideo Kojima famously fell out on the project, leaving many to assume that it was just rushed out unfinished, which is definitely evident by the lack of content in the second half. Overall, it's just a big shame. Number 2, Assassin's Creed 3. After building up the modern-day story of Desmond, explored through the genetic memories of his ancestors, Assassin's Creed 3, well, kinda decided to mess it up right at the final hurdle. With the original writer out, many questions remained unanswered going into the third game. Desmond's identity, scheming god Minerva, closest ally Lucy's betrayal, and what about that whole thing with Adam and Eve that we glimpsed in AC2? It's kind of never answered. Well, Ubisoft themselves seemed uninterested in tying any of these threads together, and so instead, we got a cliche story about Desmond sacrificing himself to prevent a solar flare from destroying the world. An assassin messiah whose growth and importance to the overarching plot of the Ancients is simply dropped along with his body. And the so-called Apple artifact at the center of the story was quickly reduced to one of many similar magical artifacts, probably the worst one in fact, thanks to the power creep that has grown over so many games. The ending of AC Valhalla finally gets back around to this story, albeit in a convoluted way but hopefully they can actually stick with it this time. Number 1, Halo Infinite. How did it come to this? 343 Studios' Halo trilogy was not the grand return for the franchise that Microsoft wanted, even if it did start pretty strong. No, instead the company has burned the people who cared the most at pretty much every turn. Die-hard fans of the game who couldn't wait to play every title in the series in one handy package, well, screw you, the Master Chief Collection was broken at launch. Are you interested in the story set up by the trailers for Halo 5? Well, screw you again, because the actual game is going to be nothing like what was presented there. With these two disasters in mind, it should have been no surprise that Halo Infinite, Microsoft's envisioned 10-year platform for the series going forward, was just as disappointing. But again, the hope was there. I mean, surely 343 couldn't mess up for a third time, and with a last-minute delay, returning Halo veterans, and a perceived commitment to get it right, maybe they finally had learned their lesson. Oh, how wrong we were. While Halo Infinite definitely had its charms and rock-solid multiplayer, the hardcore fans started getting burnt fast. The promised split-screen co-op campaign that was 80% complete cancelled. Forge? Delayed. New seasons of content? So few and far between, it was a joke. While it started well enough, the lack of content for Infinite burned those dedicated fans who actually gave it a chance and committed to it at launch, and it doesn't look like there's going to be any salvation anytime soon.
Hello all of you beautiful people, Jules here for WhatCulture.com, and this is the thing, at their core, games are indeed games. An agreement between the developer and the player in which they actually want you to see things through to the end, because at the end of the day, that's how you make a successful title. But these games here clearly didn't get the message, as they actively try to take you down when you're doing well. So let's take a look at them, as I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video games that punish you for doing well. Number 10, skill-based matchmaking ruins the fun for casual players. Call of Duty. So Call of Duty may be one of the most popular multiplayer video game franchises, and say it with me kids, of all time! But a large portion of the player base absolutely loathes the series' use of skill-based matchmaking, or SBMM for short. Now in theory, SBMM ensures that players are continually lobbied up with opponents of a skill level that is approximate to their own, basically making sure that players meet other players in accordance to how they've been performing. But in practice, SBMM often ends up punishing players who have just 1 or 2 above average games, only to quickly find themselves flung into a server filled with high-skilled veterans. Now while this isn't really an issue for competitive or hardcore players, it severely penalizes casual players who just perhaps only jump on for a few rounds every now and then, as after a few well-played games they'll end up being thrown into the deep end. Now SBMM has always been controversial with COD fans, but it's an especially major bone of contention in the recent Black Ops Cold War, because its implementation was aggressive enough that some players have reported quitting the game entirely because of it. Ouch. Number 9, reach M. Bison without a KO and fight Akuma instead. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo has a hilarious air quotes reward for players who manage to fight their way through to the arcade mode's final boss, M. Bison, without using a single continue, and also achieving a high score and doing so in just under 25 minutes. If you satisfy all of these mad conditions, then just as M. Bison prepares to fight you, he'll be knocked out by Akuma, who will take his place as the final boss. Now, cool as it might seem, Akuma is obscenely strong, and basically capable of reading your movements and performing devastating attacks, which will make short work of most unsuspecting players. And to heighten the intimidation factor, he also shows up to the fight without a name or a portrait by his life bar. While players might be at first excited to see him, as playing well to unlock this secret boss is its own reward, you then realize it's your only reward, as after seconds of taking him on, that excitement will change to frustration as your face is floored into the ground again and again. Number 8, bonus chapters are only unlockable by killing your own units. Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon. Now, it's totally common for RPGs to set various conditions for players who wish to reach secret areas and play optional missions, generally requiring them to go the extra mile in pursuit of that precious extra content. But Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon bafflingly goes in the opposite direction entirely, as most of its Gaiden chapters can only be accessed if you've got less than 15 characters in your entire army. As a result, players with a large roster will effectively be locked out from playing these chapters, in turn encouraging them to literally get the majority of their army killed on purpose. Given that the series has been historically concerned with creating a bond between players and their army and encouraging them to protect their units at all costs, this feels massively against the tone and unsurprisingly proved quite controversial. Number 7, being wealthy gets you the greedy ending. Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl. Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl is a ludicrously challenging survival horror FPS, such that players shouldn't really be criticized for hoarding their resources and scavenging everything they possibly can. And yet, the most frugal and money-minded of players who make it to the end of the game with their coffers intact will actually end up receiving perhaps the most insulting of the game's 7 endings. The so-called greedy ending is given to players who have more than 50,000 ruble to their name before triggering the end sequence. At this point, they're forced to watch an entire video where the protagonist asks the wish granter for huge wealth, and while he first appears to be showered in coins, they're actually nuts and bolts of the ceiling causing the roof to collapse and crush him to death. Given that the game encourages cautiousness, it's little surprise that most players end up receiving this ending the first time, which feels like a bit of a slap in the face after slogging your way to the end, right? Number 6. The difficulty meter makes combat harder as you perform better. God Hand. Cult's classic PS2 beat-em-up God Hand features a rather unusual riff on typical dynamic difficulty mechanics, because unlike the overwhelming majority of games, the calculations are not hidden behind the scenes in this game's code. Rather, there's a literal meter at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen which displays your level, and this level changes depending on how well or how poorly you're handling the combat. As you land attacks without being hit, this meter will fill up from 1 to a potential 4th level called Die, and receiving damage will cause it to drop down again. Now, earlier levels won't allow enemies to attack unless they're in your line of sight, while in later stages of this mechanic, they can attack you from any vantage point and are also strong enough to defeat players in just a few hits. It's an interesting mechanic because despite being a level meter, it does nothing to elevate the player's own stats as they rise up through the ranks, instead simply attempting to balance the difficulty in a bizarrely upfront way. Now, players are used to being manipulated by invisible difficulty adjustments, so seeing it so blatantly implemented right in the player's face has been both a source of fascination and infuriation. Number 5. The Nemesis gun loses power if you level it up. Cave Story. The Nemesis is one of the last weapons that you can unlock in Cave Story, and it is an absolute belter. A gun capable of dealing high levels of damage while also coming complete with unlimited ammo. That is, if you don't bother to level the weapon up, because unlike every other weapon in Cave Story, the Nemesis actually becomes less powerful the more you level it up, and at level 3 will only fire rubber ducks, which deal a pathetic amount of damage. Given that you only need 1 XP to level up the Nemesis, the developers were clearly having a little fun with the players here, encouraging them to inadvertently nerf one of the game's best weapons in the pursuit of what they assumed to be progress. Number 4. Surviving longer in the opening fight skews the game's difficulty. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. The first major combat encounter in Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice sees the player battling a seemingly unending wave of respawning Northman warriors. And that's because the fight is actually scripted to be unwinnable, and you can save yourself both a ton of time and a massive headache later on by just letting yourself die in record time. But those who put up a mighty fight against these warriors while playing on the dynamic auto difficulty will see the game immediately adjust to their strong performance, starting players on a high level of difficulty from the offset. You can obviously help bring the difficulty down by just getting yourself killed a few times, but given that persevering through the fight is an easy mistake to make, it's pretty outrageous that those playing on auto difficulty then have to start the main game at something of a massive disadvantage. Number 3. Hitting level 99 unleashes a devastating glitch. Phantasy Star 4. So Phantasy Star 4 is an especially curious title, given that, unlike every other game on this list, its punishment is in no way intended by the developer. Basically, the RPG shipped with a glitch which affected players who level any of their characters to level 99, resulting in party members randomly swapping stats or losing skills entirely, and even nerfing characters by dozens of levels while still displaying level 99. Though the bug was fixed for some re-releases, anyone playing the original version effectively had their hard work thrown back in their bloody face. Given that you don't actually need to be level 99 or anywhere near close to beat this game, it's been suggested by some fans that this glitch may have been included on purpose to punish power levelers. But the simplest solution is usually the right one, so it's far more likely that this was nothing more than an unfortunate accident. Still, it stings quite a lot. Number 2. The blue shell attacks first place. Mario Kart. Need I say more about why this punishes people who are doing well? I mean, just look at this footage, look at it, and weep, my friends. Ow. And number 1. Realm Divide pits everyone against you. Total War Shogun 2. Total War Shogun 2 is a fantastic game, albeit one that also includes the somewhat controversial Realm Divide mechanic, where players who end up controlling a large amount of the available territory or manage to capture Kyoto will become the enemy of, well, everyone. When Realm Divide is activated by reaching a certain level of fame, every other non-allied clan will team up to take you down, while your relationship with allies and vassals becomes fractious enough that they'll likely turn on you in due course. Realm Divide can often be triggered when players are far from being able to take on the might of numerous large forces like this, nor shoulder the economic burden of your trade operations suddenly being obliterated. Though the mechanic makes a certain amount of strategic sense, that the non-dominant parties would combine their forces to take out the overarching threat to their power, it still results in players receiving a punishment that does not measure up to the actions they've taken thus far.
Not too long ago, you might have spotted a list on What Culture hosted by the lovely Jules about video games that punish you for being a bad dude. Well, sometimes video games punish you for being a good guy too. They sure do keep us guessing. In this list, we're tucking into the video games that let you choose what seemed to be a no-brainer good moral choice, only to pull the rug out from under you and punish you for it. Whether the game offered you a choice and it turned out the unethical option was less damaging, or you were pushed into a corner where the ethical choice was clear but would cause you a crazy amount of trauma, there was nothing easy about these dilemmas. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 video games that punish you for making the ethical choice. Number 10, Vampire. Don't Nod released action role-playing game Vampire in 2018, where, and this should come as no surprise, you play as a vampire. Of course, being a vampire, you're met with an ethical conundrum right off the bat, and Vampire lets you choose if you want to be a bad guy or a good guy. You don't have to kill innocents, but not doing so leaves you pretty much incapable of leveling up. If you aren't consuming human blood and killing civilians, you'll miss out on vital experience points, vampiric powers, and both active and passive skills, making combat much more difficult. It's also a hell of a lot more fun to become an uber-powerful vampire via the means of being unethical, so that's another punishment in and of itself. On the upside, you will have an easier time maintaining Reed's cover as a doctor if you aren't running around town doing murders, but on the downside, pretty much everything else. Number 9, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. There are a lot of choices you can make in The Witcher 3 which seem like the right thing to do and then end up being the super wrong thing to do. This happens over and over again, but surely the most brutal of these situations concerns the ultimate fate of your ward Ciri. You spend a huge portion of the game looking for her, and then when you do, the game is running a set of checks in the background to see how you treat her, which actually has life or death consequences. The kicker here is that to keep Ciri alive, you actually have to let her maintain her independence and go off and do her own thing, which is kind of hard because as Geralt, you sort of just want to be overprotective and make sure nothing can hurt her. If you try to solve all her problems for her, protect her from the Emperor by encouraging her not to go or treating her too much like a child by insisting you'll accompany her wherever she goes, she actually won't feel capable during the final battle. These are little decisions you'll be making the whole game, which might feel like the right thing to do because she's already been through so much and you can finally protect her, but they'll actually lead to her death. And there's nothing quite like a 150-hour game leading to the death of a beloved character as a punishment for being nice. Number 7, Until Dawn. Until Dawn is a game where you can get everybody killed, so it's fair enough you'd want to stay on your toes and perhaps question whether the ethical choice is the right one. Now, it might not be the right choice to follow the voice of your friend crying out for help down a creepy dark tunnel, but she is doing a lot of crying out for you, so it's certainly the ethical thing to do. If you've already read the passage you can find in-game saying the game's main antagonist, the Wendigo, can imitate voices, or you found the lost totem that shows Ashley's head getting ripped off, this would be a very silly thing to do. But you do hear your friend calling out for help, so off you go. Be a good guy. Being the ethical bastion of good I know you are, you'll venture down that sinister hallway just in case it turns out your friend is in fact in danger. She isn't, and you're now dead, but I respect you for trying. Number 6, Frostpunk. These next two games are actually both made by the same developer, 11-Bit Studios. So when it comes to ensuring you have to stay in the ethical grey realm to succeed lest you be punished, they're kind of the experts. Frostpunk is a 2018 survival game where you'll have to make some pretty brutal choices to keep your city functioning and your people alive. Given this is a cutthroat strategy game where climate change has pushed humanity to its limits, trying to make all of the ethical choices will run your city into the ground very quickly. The stakes and challenges are incredibly high, and keeping your citizens fed, warm, and content is a constant battle. On top of that, you're called on to establish laws as the leader of the city, and some of these really go places. For example, you can build a cemetery, which is a good and ethical thing to do, but burials will take time away from your workers, which already have limited daytime work hours. You can also make a law that signs off on child labor, which adds to the number of people working in the city, but obviously is not an ethical choice at all. If that wasn't hard enough, you're met with personal requests too, where meeting someone's individual needs might hurt everybody else. You'll have a far easier path through the game being a tyrant, but sleeping at night might be tricky. Number 5, This War of Mine. There's a Papers, Please genre of game that seems like it just wants you to be sad, and This War of Mine absolutely fits into that bucket. This War of Mine is a strategy survival game where you'll have to make difficult choices for a group of civilians hiding out in a fictional city under siege. You'll need to maintain the group's health, hunger, and mood, and deal with encounters with other NPC survivors. This is where things get tricky. Well, trickier. Outsiders will ask for food and medicine, and it's up to you to help them if you want, or you can rob or kill them. Of course, the ethical thing would be to help your fellow man, but giving away your extremely scarce supplies is going to make things incredibly difficult for you in-game and for the survivability of your group. If for some reason that doesn't already sound like a painful ethical nightmare to you, you can always grab the Little Ones DLC. This expansion adds a child survivor who can't help to shelter initially or defend themselves, but needs constant attention, is prone to depression, and needs to be taught to help out with various chores over time. It's a losing battle trying to keep everyone safe and happy the entire time, but making the ethical choices in this instance will often make things far more dire. Number 4, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. When Assassin's Creed Odyssey was set up to be the first game in the series that would actually let you make meaningful decisions that have consequences, Ubisoft did not do things by half measures. They also seem to have a pretty fun time trolling you, as one of the earliest decisions where a no-brainer good guy move seems to be the right call actually results in devastating consequences. The Blood Fever quest kicks off very early when you're still on Kefalonia. You encounter a plague-ridden family, including small children, and you either defend them from those intent on killing them to stop the spread, or allow them to be executed. Now, to be fair, this is an ethical conundrum. Leaving the family alive could put others at risk of catching the plague, but murdering them in cold blood seems inexcusably wrong. If you make the kinder choice in the interim and spare the family their violent fate, you actually end up dooming the entire island. If you do make the trip back later in the game, you'll find that the entire island has been devastated by the plague and many people have died, so that's kind of an oops on your part. Number 3, Tyranny. Tyranny is an RPG from Obsidian Entertainment that came out in 2016, and it's probably the strongest contender for a game that will absolutely screw you over for trying to be nice. Or, for the purposes of our list, punish you for making the ethical choice. As the name implies, this is not a game about being nice. You're literally working for an evil empire and trying to maintain control over the people you've conquered the best way you know how. Your choices here range from lawful evil to chaotic neutral, but you'll be erring closer to doing what's best for you and your superiors rather than just going around handing out money and picking all the blue options. You can support your tyrannical leader, be a different kind of evil, or decide you only care about yourself. But not leaning into one of the more evil routes is going to be more difficult and honestly less fun. If you start feeling too bad, you can always pull the, hey man, I just work here logic. So what are you waiting for? Go on over to that dark side. Number 2, Bloodborne. It shouldn't come as a great surprise that Bloodborne is a brutal game with a brutal game world that offers you brutal consequences for any of your in-game choices, but just in case it does, you've been warned. If you try and save all the friendly NPCs you meet out and about in the nasty game world, you'll get them all killed. It doesn't matter if you send them all to Yosefka's clinic or the chapel, you'll more than likely lead most of them to their untimely deaths. The caveat to this is if you send the suspicious beggar from the Forbidden Woods to Yosefka's clinic. Do this and you'll still get the guy killed, but since he's a cannibal, you won't let him loose on the rest of your townies. Send anybody to the clinic and Yosefka will experiment on them and kill them horribly. Send the beggar to the chapel and he'll systematically kill off everybody there. Also horribly. To be fair though, when you do meet this particular NPC, he is munching on a kid's corpse, so that one's kinda on you. Number 1, A Plague Tale Requiem. Enormous spoiler warning for you here. I have to tell you what happens at the very end of A Plague Tale Requiem, which is the second game in the Plague Tale series. So if you don't want to know what happens, that's okay. Just meet me over at the next video. But for everybody else, let's talk about this absolutely horrible ethical choice. A Plague Tale Requiem is the hotly anticipated 2022 follow-up to the critically acclaimed A Plague Tale Innocence, and it ends on a hell of a note. After spending 2 games doing your best to stave off the macular infection from overwhelming Amicia's little brother Hugo, an extremely unexpected thing happens, and it turns out you're simply too late. Believing his sister to be dead, tiny little Hugo gives himself over to the aggressive genetic condition, becoming entirely possessed by it. You're left with a couple of options, and both of them are bad. You can walk away from the shell of your little brother, now entirely merged with macula, dooming the world to be destroyed by rats, or you can kill him off with your sling, which is the ethical choice, and one of the worst things a video game has asked me to do in 2022, and probably ever. Sure, if you don't do it, Lucas will do it for you, but if that's not a punishment, I don't know what is.
Now, open world games are among the most popular video game genres for a good reason. They offer up an obscene amount of content to experience within a richly realized sprawling world, and who doesn't love that? And generally speaking, most open world games are designed to reward the player for straying from the beaten path and exploring every last possible nook and cranny on the map. But the sheer mind-boggling amount of work that goes into even a mediocre open world game means that developers can't always manage to balance everything correctly, sometimes resulting in players being effectively punished for their adventurous curiosity. Because, they've just become stupidly overpowered. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 open world games that punish you for 100%. Number 10, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. Now, there's a fundamental disconnect between the sheer amount of awesome things The Witcher 3 allows you to do and how thoroughly they undermine the natural flowing cadence of the main quest line. Now, the game's side quests are among the most acclaimed in gaming, enough that many consider them superior to the main ones, so you really can't be blamed for tackling a ton of them as soon as they're made available, right? Well, except that doing so will ensure that you're hilariously overpowered throughout the bulk of the story. If you complete a large number of side content before reaching the third act, you'll absolutely breeze through the rest of the main quests. As incredible a game as it is, due to the lack of difficulty scaling and over-generous doling out of XP, especially in main storyline missions, you're basically given an easier, less rewarding experience if you plow through all of the side quests early. It might actually be unfulfilling enough to actively encourage you to ignore side content on your first playthrough and instead focus on a more challenging main quest line, whilst saving all of that extra stuff for another go-around. Number 9, Spider-Man Miles Morales. While most open-world games on this list at least offer up hundreds of hours of potential content which would dissuade some from even attempting 100%, the same can't really be said for Spider-Man Miles Morales. It's perfectly reasonable to 100% this game in less than 20 hours, and so even non-completionists might even be tempted to give it a shot, even if only to wring a little more value out of their purchase. As a result, it's incredibly easy just to blow through all of the available side content, level up a ton, and have enough skill points accrued to become hilariously overpowered. In turn, this basically makes the latter stages of the campaign a mere triviality, at least on the amazing difficulty and below, that is. While some might argue that a Spider-Man game by its sheer nature handles being OP better than other open world games, I mean it's about superheroic wish fulfillment after all, it does nevertheless make the air quotes tougher final hours of the game seem a little bit too easy for their own good. Number 8, Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning. The original release of Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning is infamous for de-incentivizing veering off the critical path if you even want a remotely challenging experience with the main quest line. Due to the abundance of side quests, high XP yield, and respawning enemies, it is incredibly easy to accidentally overlevel yourself, enough so that fans have even gone to the lengths of creating their own guides for how to avoid doing so. Overleveling can make combat intensely boring as you just rip through enemies with a mechanical efficiency, while gaining little of interest from their drops. It is a game that absolutely does not require grinding from the player at all, and can arguably become so easy through progression as to feel almost broken. Even if you deliberately ignore some side quests that you actually want to play and consistently run past enemies, you're still going to almost certainly have an easy time with the main campaign. So if you're trying to do everything, well, it's going to become a cinch to the point of tedium. Thankfully, the 2020 remaster reworked the enemy scaling in order to offer more pushback, even if it still is far from perfect. Number 7, Borderlands. Now this is true in varying degrees of all the 3 mainline Borderland games, whereby blasting your way through the side content, especially if you include the DLC, along with the main story in a single player mode, is a guaranteed path to become outrageously OP. Being a completionist will ensure the focal engagements offer up little to no resistance, even later in the game, and as fun as the combat feels regardless, some of the shine does get taken off it when there's no real sense of accomplishment. Thankfully, Borderlands 2 introduced the considerably more difficult True Vault Hunter mode, effectively a new game plus, but for anyone who generally beats games once and then just moves on, well, it didn't provide much solace. If you want to just comprehensively beat a Borderlands game once and start playing something else, you need to either ditch some of the side content or make peace with the fact that you will absolutely rip and tear through this game without much opposition. Number 6, Assassin's Creed Valhalla. The Assassin's Creed games get regularly ragged on for their stringent adherence to the Ubisoft formula, whereby the map is cluttered with a litany of peripheral gubbins blatantly intended to pad out the experience and increase its perceived value. But an equally disappointing byproduct of this is that in the case of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, hoovering up all of this side content makes the game absurdly easy. It doesn't help at all that Valhalla is by far the easiest of the series' open world entries, and so even with a cursory amount of busy busy work completed, you'll be able to soundly curb stomp the majority of what the main game throws at you. Naturally, anybody putting in 100 hours plus into a completionist run will end up doing a lot of tediously unchallenging work, even on the higher difficulties. Few people want an Assassin's Creed game to be like Dark Souls, but the overall leveling system feels woefully unbalanced for anybody wandering off the main path. Number 5. Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Surely no open world game in recent memory has been guiltier of punishing your curiosity than Xenoblade Chronicles 3. It's arguably been a significant problem with the series since its inception, that by simply stopping to explore the lush world, you're liable to become so powerful that the main story is an absolute joke. Given the ludicrous amounts of things that you can and probably will want to do in the game, it's incredibly difficult to keep step with the level recommendations for the main questline, short of actually forcing yourself to stop exploring, and that absolutely sucks. This obviously isn't the way that most people want to experience the story, but the alternative is just bossing your way through it with minimal resistance. Perhaps worst of all though, being over-leveled will also result in you receiving a meager amount of class points, making it difficult to advance your class progress. If that's not punishing you for doing everything this game has to offer, what else is? A game with this much to explore and experience shouldn't penalize the player for daring to do so. Number 4. Dragon's Dogma. If you bother to complete most of the side quests in Dragon's Dogma, let alone all of them, prepare for the rest of the main story to feel like a joyless chore, given how easily you'll just steamroll through it. Once you reach level 30, there is little in the main game that'll be anything beyond a mild inconvenience, enough that fans have even created mods to change how much XP is doled out throughout. As terrific as the combat is in Dragon's Dogma, it can't fully compensate for how easily it can become a challenge-devoid experience. Though the enhanced Dark Arisen edition did at least provide a few welcome tweaks to the overall difficulty level. All the same, for a game with a level cap of 200, you'll be able to wipe the floor with most about everything long before that, and the power fantasy of being an unstoppable juggernaut doesn't quite paper over the eventual boredom that sets in. Number 3. Crackdown. Crackdown is admittedly a deeply silly, rough-around-the-edges franchise that probably wouldn't have hooked many players in if it offered a crushing level of difficulty. That said, it's easy to imagine many dipping from each of the game's mid-campaign, given how easily you can become an absolute Goliath against which nothing stands much of a chance. It's incredibly simple to end up leveled far past the recommended point for a given mission, and while there's absolutely a fleeting joy to obliterating enemies as a can't-be-stopped badass, the general lack of variety means that being overpowered soon enough just becomes a real bore. Crackdown 3 admittedly offered up a little more challenge than its predecessors by way of a dynamic AI system, but it was still exceptionally easy to smite anything the game threw at you with just a little exploration. A power fantasy is one thing, but when the gameplay is so dead simple and lacking in finesse, it's just not enough. Number 2. God of War Ragnarok. God of War Ragnarok is an astonishing achievement and one of the finest AAA games of the last few years, hands down, but that doesn't mean that it's perfect. Despite how expertly engineered and designed the game undeniably is, it nevertheless suffers from one of its predecessor's most cited issues, a lack of balance between side quests and mainline content. In Ragnarok, if you dare to tackle the side quests as they become available rather than saving them for later on, you're liable to end up with a comically OP Kratos, a sheer wrecking ball of a protagonist who will pulverize his way to easy victory. Given the majority of the game's side quests are well worth playing as they add a lot of flavor and backstory to the casted characters, you can't really blame players for wanting to mop up every last one they can find. The end result, though, is that the tension of the main campaign will end up unavoidably diluted, and so players are forced to make an agonizing choice between ingesting the story-based side quests as they pop up, as they were clearly designed to be, or saving them for later and pushing forward for a more challenging main story. Given that the side quests are smartly woven into the point of the game that they become available, neither choice is actually ideal at all and effectively creates a problem for players who wish to industriously experience everything in an organic way. And number 1, Dragon Age Inquisition. Though Dragon Age Inquisition is admittedly only a semi-open world game, it still does fall prey to the same pitfall as all of these prior games, and that is failing to reconcile the appeal of going for 100% with a meaningful, challenging main questline. From early on in the game, there is a jaw-dropping number of side quests which can be completed, though doing so will quickly ensure that you are, you guessed it, over-leveled. It's clear that BioWare mistakenly assumed that most players would rinse the story at warp speed and then return to the side content. But given how many fans have complained about ending up OP long before the final boss fight, that clearly wasn't the case. Now, in fairness, Inquisition's side missions aren't actually all that great, and for all but the most obsessive of players, it becomes pretty easy to persuade yourself to leave a lot of them well alone. But for those who do accept the challenge and try to knock everything off, well, they're going to wind up with a risibly anticlimactic final battle. What a great reward for exploration, right?
Generally speaking, most video games have relatively simplistic morality choices. Good behaviour gets rewarded, and being naughty will get you punished with a bad ending. But not all games are created equal, and sometimes developers have found ways to cruelly toy with the notion that good deeds reap rewards. In fact, many of the games in this list seem to actively laugh at the very idea that you should expect a positive, fortuitous result for granting mercy to an NPC. I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video games that punish you for showing mercy. Number 10. Buy a prostitute's freedom, she gets murdered a few days later. Red Dead Redemption. In Red Dead Redemption's Stranger Side mission, Eva in Peril, you'll see a pimp by the name of Mario savagely beating the prostitute, Eva. While you can simply kill Mario to end Eva's suffering, though she'll run away from you in terror, there is a seemingly more peaceful, diplomatic route. If you walk up to Mario, he'll offer you the opportunity to buy Eva's freedom for $200. If you accept, that'll seemingly be the end of the matter. Mario gets his money, and a grateful Eva thanks you as she prepares to get a fresh start as a free woman. You'll be prompted to check back in on Eva a few days later, however, and find that Mario has killed and buried her in a shallow grave. Upon confronting Mario, he'll be unrepentant about her death, leading to a draw in which the player must kill him, as naturally proves quite satisfying. Still, the cruel dramatic irony here is significant. In attempting to save 2 lives by paying Mario off, 2 people end up dead. It's far from the only stranger story in the game that dares to troll players like this, but it's probably the most heartrending. Number 9. Help a woman find her missing ring, get attacked. The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. In thankfully less tragic circumstances, The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind quickly taught players to not simply trust NPCs who can rustle up a decent sob story. In the side quest, The Lady's Ring, a lady by the name of Senette Jeline will beg for your help, asking you to retrieve her expensive ring which she has lost in a nearby pond. If you agree to help her and take a swim in search of the ring, once you've found it and emerge back on land, you'll find yourself being attacked by Senette and her bandit friend Tavernu Tedran, who is apparently using an enchantment to appear cloaked. And so, with your faith in apparently regular folk shaken, you've got little choice but to battle and kill the pair. Rather weak foes and don't put up much of a fight, it's still sure to leave you incredibly paranoid about seemingly well-meaning NPCs for the next few hours. Number 8. Free an imprisoned man, release an evil spirit. Dark Souls 2. While in Aldia's Keep in Dark Souls 2, you'll come across Royal Sorcerer Navlan, a young man who is sealed behind a magic barrier. If you speak to him, he'll reveal that he cloistered himself away after becoming possessed by an evil, murderous spirit and implores you not to release him. However, if you decide to ignore his warnings and those scattered around the keep, perhaps believing him to not be of sound mind, you'll be rewarded by having the dark spirit version of Navlan invade your game at numerous locations. You can avoid being invaded by simply killing Navlar's human form, making it clear that for the sake of all involved, you were better off just leaving him locked away. He might be imprisoned, but he's still breathing, right? Number 7. Turn a blind eye to incorrect papers, get your wages garnished. Papers, please. Papers, Please is perhaps gaming's ultimate expression of the banality of evil. You're cast in the role of a border-crossing immigrant officer working for the fictional nation of Astotska. The player is tasked with reviewing the documentation of both incoming immigrants and returning citizens and deciding whether to let them into the country or not. This forces you to make some tough decisions, such as whether to grant entry to those in dire straits whose paperwork may have inconsistencies. The human argument of turning a blind eye speaks for itself, yet doing so will eventually get you a citation from the Ministry of Admission, as will result in your wages being garnished. If you're not careful, you can end up without enough money for rent, food, heat, or medicine for your family, resulting in an ending where they all die. It's brutal, but so perfectly encapsulates the game's thorny moral compass, where players must balance the well-being of themselves and their loved ones with that of others. Number 6. Save the fake Rachni Queen, get betrayed. Mass Effect 3. In the first Mass Effect, players are given the choice of either killing or freeing the insectoid Rachni Queen. Whether you let her live or kill her, the morality of your actions are left relatively ambiguous, given the lack of a guarantee that this Rachni Queen will avoid following in her forebears' destructive footsteps. If you do kill the Queen, however, in Mass Effect 3, the Reapers will have created a genetically engineered version known as a breeder. Once again, the player is given a choice to spare or kill the Queen, which in this instance has had its mind warped by its own artificial creation. Yet after the anguish of the first game's decision, many players no doubt decided to grant mercy to this variation, no matter its unnatural origins. But if you do grant the breeder a stay of execution, she'll eventually prove more trouble than she's worth, turning on Shepard and causing catastrophic losses to the ongoing war effort. You'll receive 100 points of damage to the Alliance Engineering Corps, and Aralak Company will be destroyed, resulting in a total loss of 200 war assets. Conversely, if you leave the breeder to die, Aralak Company will join your side. Number 5. Save Miguel's life and he kidnaps a child. Octopath Traveler. In Alfin's story, an Octopath Traveler, you'll encounter Miguel, an apparent farmer who Alfin treats and in turn saves his life. However, it's soon revealed that Miguel isn't exactly who Alfin thinks. He's a thief and a murderous mercenary. Yet Alfin is firmly committed to the belief that he should heal anyone in need, no matter who they are, and even gets Miguel to promise to repent his criminal ways and live as a good man. Unsurprisingly, Alfin's mercy isn't rewarded, but quite the opposite. Once Miguel is rested up, he breaks his vow, kidnapping a child and demanding a ransom from their mother, all while wounding the child to make a point. Alfin and his party then hunt Miguel down and engage him in battle, eventually killing him. But the matter doesn't quite end there. It's clear for the remainder of Alfin's story that the experience has majorly shaken him, even causing him to doubt his standing as an apothecary. Though the player isn't given a choice about healing Miguel, it's still devastating to see Alfin's idealistic mindset crushed quite so brutally. Number 4. Give a beggar some money and he gets instantly robbed. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2 The Sith Lords offers up a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, though mostly just trolls you if you decide to help a person in need. When a beggar asks the player for a few credits, you'll be able to choose whether or not to hand some money over, but if you do decide to be generous, you'll be swiftly reprimanded for it in doubly cruel fashion. First off, the protagonist's mentor Kreia will criticise your decision, suggesting that even the best intended of acts can have unforeseen negative consequences. To hammer the point home, the scene then cuts to the beggar being beaten and robbed by a fellow refugee, ensuring your act of kindness only got the poor guy hurt. Hilariously though, if you rebuff the beggar, you'll be chastised by Kreia for falling prey to your emotions, and you're then forced to watch as the prior situation is basically flipped. The beggar beats the crap out of the guy who beat him up in the other scenario. Harsh. Number 3. Give Yorvev his sword back, cause a massacre. The Witcher 2 Assassins of Kings. In The Witcher 2's first chapter, players are given the option of either siding with Rebel Elf Yorvev or Blue Stripes Commander Roach when the latter crashes your meeting with Letho. If you decide to give Yorvev his sword back at his insistence, this has the later consequence of prompting Bernard Laredo to start a race massacre in Flotsam whereby the humans there band together to slaughter the non-human residents. That's quite the butterfly effect moment, especially considering that if you rebuff Yorvev and instead punch him in the throat, Laredo will throw a party in Flotsam and the only immediate casualty will be the suicide of brothel proprietor Margot. In terms of pure body count, it's clear that one choice is far less harmful than the other, yet this isn't at all obvious when you're making the decision. And so if you felt like giving Yorvev a break by handing his sword back, you probably regretted it a short while later. Number 2. Let Clarence Little live, he'll try to kill you later. Grand Theft Auto 4. Granted, the Grand Theft Auto series is so jam-packed with distrustful degenerates, often including the player character themselves, that giving them the benefit of the doubt is just asking for trouble. In GTA 4's mission Holland Knights, you're tasked with taking out Clarence Little, a drug dealer and pimp who has threatened to expose the corrupt actions of Deputy Police Commissioner Francis McReary. After killing Clarence's men, Nico chases him down. Clarence drops his gun, begs for his life, and promises to quit his life of crime, at which point the player is given a choice: kill Clarence or let him go. If you grant Clarence mercy, however, he'll reappear later in the game as a random encounter, and rather than having reformed himself as promised, he's out for revenge. As a brief confrontation, Clarence pulls a gun and you're left with no choice but to kill him. Given that there's no true way to spare Clarence in the game, the message here seems to be that mercy is futile. As a result, you may as well have just cut out the middleman and killed him during the earlier mission. Number 1. Save Abby, get beaten to death. The Last of Us Part 2. Now in the case of The Last of Us Part 2, the player isn't given any choice about what to do, but that doesn't make the ironic twist sting any less. In the early hours of the game, Joel and his brother Tommy are on patrol when they save a stranger, Abby, from a fleet of infected. Joel and Tommy, being the world-weary sort they are, could have just as easily left Abby to her own devices, but they chose to save her. The consequences of this is something that nobody saw coming. The three return to an outpost where Abby's friends are, only to be attacked by the group. Ultimately, this leads to Joel being brutally beaten to death by Abby with a golf club, is there any other way, while Ellie is forced to watch. As is revealed later in the game, Abby killed Joel in revenge for killing her father in the closing moments of the first game. He was the Firefly surgeon preparing to perform the fateful operation on Ellie. Again, we as the player had no control over whether to save Abby or not, but it was still a majorly bitter pill to see Joel's decision to help another come back to bite him in the most ultimate of ways.
Now, death is a part of video games, just as it is a part of life. It forces the player to reconsider their strategy moving forward, or perhaps not so gently lets them know that they're not yet equipped to take on this challenge. Now, most games will simply let you resume play at a nearby checkpoint, with little in the way of a tangible punishment beyond some lost time and a slightly bruised ego. But there are some games that dare to take death a little more seriously and will introduce stakes, for better or worse, that ensure the player wants to avoid dying at all costs. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video games that punish you for dying. Number 10, making you sit through a long revival animation. Too Human. There's something distinctly passive-aggressive about video games which make you sit through a lengthy, unskippable cinematic before getting back into the action, and there's perhaps no better example of this than Too Human. Upon dying in Silicon Knights' ill-fated action RPG, you're forced to sit through an almost 30-second animation in which a Valkyrie descends from the heavens and resurrects you, allowing gameplay to then resume. And given that you're likely to die a lot in this game, and again this is a bafflingly unskippable cutscene, it turns death from a mildly irritating triviality into a deeply rage-inducing punishment. And to make matters worse, there isn't even any variation to the cinematic at all. In light of the vocal feedback, one of the Too Human designers doused further fuel on the fire by suggesting that the complaint simply implied that players were desperate to get back into gameplay as fast as possible, whilst also revealing that making the cutscene skippable would actually be an easy change. The change never came though, and to this day anybody who commits the grave sin of perishing whilst playing Too Human will have to sit through that Valkyrie animation again and again and again. Utterly hateful, right? Number 9, community morale takes a hit. State of Decay. It's admittedly only inevitable that people are going to die in the midst of a zombie outbreak, but State of Decay takes a relatively unique approach to this by considering the impact somebody's death would have on a tight-knit community. Dying in the survival horror game doesn't really result in a game over, but it will cause the community morale to take a collective hit, and you'll notice a significantly more negative attitude amongst the remaining survivors. So there you have it. When you're out battling the undead, you've got the mental health of an entire settlement to think about as well. Now, morale can be rebalanced by completing missions and bringing both survivors and supplies back home, but forcing players to think outside of the single character that they're playing as is a certainly unique rub for the genre. If you get yourself killed out there, you're going to make life worse for a whole lot of people. As such, every action carries that little extra emotional weight. Number 8. Enemies grow stronger. Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor. Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor came up with one of the most fascinating mechanical punishments for death in the history of the medium, courtesy of its innovative Nemesis system. Any Uruk who manages to kill the player will subsequently be tracked and promoted to captain, in turn making them even tougher to kill the next time that you cross paths with them. Now, granted, the Nemesis system can also be advantageous for the player as well, to grow more powerful and dismantle the Uruk ranks from within, but if an Uruk manages to get the better of you, you'll need to put in the prep time to take them down in the inevitable rematch. For the standards of this list, it's perhaps relatively light as death punishments go, but as an incredibly smart and creative way to make the player rethink their in-game mortality, the Nemesis system is nevertheless really quite brilliant. If you're wondering why countless games haven't imitated this system on their own ends, it's likely because Warner Brothers actually secured a patent for it. So they are literally hoarding the fun. Boo! Number 7, permadeath. XCOM. Now, the XCOM franchise has been lauded since its inception for its remorseless level of difficulty, which forces players to consider the damaging potential of every single move they make. Now, the rub is that any soldier who dies in duty is permanently dead for the remainder of your campaign. There's no way to save them or use your resources to generate more of the exact same unit. As such, losing experienced soldiers during a skirmish can be massively demoralizing, forcing the player to push ahead with their less skilled personnel who will almost certainly fall to the alien enemy forces. Basically, the name of the game is keeping your best guys alive at all costs, because once you start to lose them, a cascade of deaths and failure is all but inevitable. Such is the agony and the ecstasy of XCOM, and that's without even getting into the punishing Iron Man mode, which limits players to a single save file in order to prevent save scumming. Yikes indeed. Number 6, the threat of permadeath. Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice. Now, there's the grim reality of permadeath, and then there's duping the player into believing that permadeath is on the cards. The latter is very much the case with Ninja Theory's excellent Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice, where upon dying for the first time, players are informed that a dark rot will grow on their protagonist every time she perishes, and if you die enough, the rot will consume her entire body and force the player to start the game from the very beginning. It was a pretty mean threat that immediately got players' backs up, yet as those who investigated eventually realized it was actually a totally empty one, because after 5 or so deaths, the rot never rises any higher up Senua's body. Even so, it's a clever little trick to keep players on their toes and suggest a greater penalty for succumbing to the game's enemies. On the other hand, some might not have appreciated the artificially induced anxiety of an actually non-existent threat. Number 5. Losing all of your acquired weapons. Wolfenstein 3D and Doom. Iconic FPS games Wolfenstein 3D and Doom popularized an especially brutal punishment for death, taking all of your acquired weapons away and leaving you only with your pathetic starter pistol. While the purest argument is that the games were both designed to be completed with the starter weapon, that's hardly the reality for the majority of players, who will rely on amassing an increasingly ridiculous arsenal in order to progress through each game. In the case of Doom, the demoralizing agony of picking up the BFG 9000 only to die a short time later and lose it is immeasurable. For all but the most committed of players, it might ultimately prevent them from ever reaching the end of the game. This is admittedly a punishment that's largely absent from modern games, especially those intentionally homaging the brutal difficulty of decades-old titles, but that makes it no less cruel a design choice in the first bloody place. Number 4. Lose 10% of your total EXP. Tibia. MMORPGs are a particularly fascinating genre where death penalties are concerned, and though most will offer up nothing beyond a temporary debuff or a small durability reduction to all equipped items, there are some certainly crueler ones out there. Take the legendary 1990s MMO Tibia, where in its original iteration, death from levels 1 to 23 will result in the player losing 10% of their total experience points and spent mana, and depending on the player's level, this could even result in them being demoted back down a level. This proved especially frustrating given that it could easily affect players with a dropped internet connection, causing them to return to find themselves robbed of hours of time through no real fault of their own. And considering the steep leveling climb in classic Tibia and the prohibitive expense of acquiring blessings that could prevent the experience lost, the cost of death is massive here. For those who value their free time, it's perhaps a bit too harsh for its own good. Number 3. You get older with each death. Sifu. Now, Sifu boasts one of the most ingeniously poignant death punishments in the history of video games. Players start the game at the age of 20, but each time they die, they respawn having gained a few years of age, which, while granting their strikes more power, also gives them less health. If the player dies enough, they'll end up in their 70s, where dying will become permanent and they'll need to start the current stage from the very beginning, undoing all of the chapter's accrued progress. Though Sifu is an incredibly challenging game in places, this unusual punishment never feels cheap, serving as a constant reminder that death has a cost. Plus, with a successful run through each chapter being relatively short, having to start from the very beginning isn't actually a gigantic time sink. Even so, it's an undeniable barrier of entry for the more casual-minded player, and those who simply loathe repetition, but it's at least a very creative way to make players question what they're doing in every single moment. Number 2. The game deletes itself. Lose-lose. Lose-Lose is a 2009 video game come art project developed by Zach Gage, a Galaga-esque shoot-'em-up in which each alien you encounter represents a file on your own computer, and for every alien you kill, a file will be permanently deleted for real. Yep. Because the aliens don't open fire on the player, you can simply attempt to dodge them, though this will almost certainly eventually result in your own demise. And the punishment, or some might say gift, for dying, well, the game deletes itself from your computer immediately. Ultimately, Lose-Lose was classified as malware, given the likely outcome that players would lose files crucial to the running of their operating system. But if you die before killing even a single alien, the game will jettison itself from your hard drive before any real damage is done. And number 1, ammo carries over after death. Jak 2 Renegade. Now, Jak 2 was generally wildly lauded by critics, though there was consistent criticism of both its high level of difficulty and the sparseness of its checkpoints. As a result, death can be a frustrating experience, and one compounded by one extra punishment, that your ammunition supply carries over after death. While the overwhelming majority of games will reset you to the previous checkpoint with all your prior ammo upon dying, Jak 2 uniquely threw you back with whatever ammo you had left upon expiring. Now, it doesn't take a games design major to appreciate why this might be problematic. It creates an ammo scarcity problem at a point where the player has already died and may well be stuck. This in turn creates a feedback loop of struggle in which the player may be ultimately compelled to quit the game and reload from their last save, an irritating added step for already frustrated players. Games are designed for player interaction and for them to impact the events on screen with control inputs. And that can create a relationship where we're constantly having to do stuff. But you know what? We're humans. We have to sometimes not do stuff and take a break. But video games, they don't like that, my friend. In fact, sometimes they actively punish you. So let's take a look at them today. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 8 video games that punish you for taking a break. Number 8, Sonic kills himself. Sonic CD. It's a very well-known fact that Sonic the Hedgehog does indeed like to go fast. Whether he's zipping through lush green hills or through the cold reaches of space in an effort to roll out the rotund villain Dr. Eggman, once and for all, he's always go, gotta go fast. In fact, it can become quite aggressive with how insistent he is to always be on the move. And there's no better example of this than in Sonic CD, where if the player isn't keeping pace, he'll throw himself into oblivion. If Sonic is left idle, he'll begin to tap his foot impatiently and check his watch occasionally in order to motivate you to moving him on. However, if you manage to spend around 2 minutes answering your phone or the door or explaining to a friend why Sonic 06 is genuinely a really good game, which some Sonic fans staunchly defend for some reason, why, I don't know why, then the chili dog eating champion will finally give up waiting and kill himself, leading to an instant game over. Pretty harsh. Number 7, any QTE experience. Now, it might seem a little vague to put any and all QuickTime event sections under one banner here, but can you honestly look me in my very bold eye and tell me that the entire mechanic doesn't seem purpose-built to keep players on edge and kill them without any warning? From being stabbed, shot, or just even trying to get a shave in Shenmue? QTEs turn what should be a moment of reprieve for the player into another tension-soaked experience. It gets so bad that if you spot even just one QTE in a game, then you know deep down you can never take a break, because the game might choose to kill you for daring to put down your controller. Worse still are those that happen after lengthy dialogue or character intros, meaning that you have to watch it all again just to possibly fail once more. Plus, it completely takes you out of the scene you're in, rendering cool cutscenes completely moot, because we're too busy focusing on what might possibly happen. Number 6, the computer selects your moves. The Pokemon franchise. So in battle, one must consider their actions long before they ever think to commit to them, as brash assaults, unplanned strikes, and foolhardy rushes can cost you a victory immediately. This is why a lot of strategy titles will allow you to plan, position, and replan all over again during the course of gameplay. And as such, you might develop a more methodical approach to your warmongering. Unfortunately, it's actually this hands-off mentality that can indeed cost you a match if you're playing a Pokemon game online. As if you end up taking too long to select a move for your monster to unleash, an internal timer will count down and then select a move for you, with it usually being the least useful one. It's not uncommon for video games to kick idle players, but to carry on the battle for them with inferior moves is somehow much worse, as now our opponent not only still has to fight against what is effectively an absentee trainer, but it makes our battle-hardened roster look like utter chumps. Number 5, Guild House Destruction. Final Fantasy XIV. So one of the most satisfying things about the monolithic Final Fantasy XIV is how its gameplay encourages players to form firm friendships and join guilds in order to progress. The level of teamwork needed to take down some of the larger raid bosses is top tier, and so it's refreshing to see the game reward guilds and parties with great loot drops and incentives to team up. However, inversely, they do seem to have an odd way of punishing those taking a bit of a rest from adventuring, especially when it comes to guild houses. As each guild HQ takes up precious server space, and the game has had a long-running issue with keeping spaces free for players, Square Enix implemented some measures to keep things decluttered as much as possible. And one such measure was that if your guild hasn't visited their house for 45 days, then the devs would send a bulldozer right through the bloody thing. As a means of compensation, they would at least pay back some of the costs of building the HQ, but still, for players looking for a break, it was pretty saddening to return to a pile of rubble. Number 4, Darkwing Duck Death. Darkwing Duck. As before mentioned, the incredibly harsh punishment of Suicide Sonic rocked the world of any gamer looking to take a small break from the action, but it turns out that this was actually a copycat mechanic that was introduced in the otherwise perfect platformer Darkwing Duck. This NES title dropped a full year before Sonic CD stuck it to players, and also included an idle animation death as punishment for gamers not on the go. If you wait around, then in classic cartoon fashion, an anvil will land on Darkwing Duck, flattening him completely and costing costing you a life. While not being as harsh as an instant game over, it's still a pretty shocking punishment for players, especially those who might just be flexing their fingers and planning their next moves. Although when you think about it, this is actually pretty fitting for the franchise, as in recent years a Darkwing Duck game by the minds behind Sonic Mania was itself squashed by the anvil of Capcom despite looking absolutely brilliant. Number 3. Unexpected Full Moon. Commander Keen. As we've shown in entries thus far, players can be punished by having their lives depleted, their games ended, and of course, their houses destroyed. But nothing will be as cheeky, quite literally, as a video game flashing their literal arse to the player for taking too long. And the hams in question belong to Commander Keen, who has no problem showing what he thinks of players wasting his time by dropping his trousers and bloody well mooning us. Now, players are unlikely to see this pale rump, as pretty much every moment of this title involves being a rude dude with a tood who is constantly on the move, but for those looking to take a moment to wipe the sweat off their brow with their tie-dye Fresh Prince of Bel-Air shirt before taking a sip of Jolt Cola, they'd be rewarded with this spit-take moment of the commander dropping his keks. Cheers, mate. Number 2. You're the slowest gamer ever. Justice League Heroes. As you might expect from a game centered around super-powered beings, Justice League Heroes is a title that is utterly hectic at the tamest of times. After all, those waves and waves of goons aren't going to put themselves in full-body casts, therefore it's punch, kick and I-beam all day long for our cast of heroes, which as you might expect, would absolutely wear you out. So why not put down the game for a second and go pop the kettle on, have a super stretch and maybe pull the spandex out of your crack? Well, because it turns out that the game will chastise you for doing so, that's why. Now, Barry Allen is most definitely the fastest man alive, well, except when Superman is involved, and even then it's like winning a game of top trumps by shooting your opponent, and as such, everything to him appears to be moving in slow motion, especially downtime when the player is busy doing something else. Should the Scarlet Speedster feel ignored, then he'll even voice his complaints stating, "I'm the fastest man alive, and you're the slowest player." Alright, Bazza, calm down, go mess around with the flow of time again if you're that bored. Actually, don't ever do that because it never works out for you. And number 1, the worst ending. The Stanley Parable. Now, to call a single ending in the almighty Stanley Parable game the worst is a bit of a fallacy, as in truth that's like calling a fine wine piss water when compared to an incredibly well-made cocktail, as both are equally delicious and both get me equally tipsy on their heady brilliance. However, if we're being honest, the ending that you receive for literally doing nothing does feel like a bit of a wasted opportunity. After all, this is a game about choices, actions, and the rather scary realization over how little impact we have over these two aspects of our lives. And so just sitting there in your tiny little office, letting the bigger questions float over you, is at once fittingly depressing, but also completely unsatisfying. If the player chooses to remain in the cubicle, the narrator will get so frustrated that they eventually begin to close out the game, listing how boring a choice this was and how it was a waste of his time as much as it was yours, the player. Brilliant.
As much as we all want to believe that video games are primarily concerned with testing your skill, that's not always true. These games all introduce random elements that could totally ruin a player's run through a given level, and rather than serve as minor inconveniences, would massively impede progress and cause major frustration. Rather than punish the player for simply not being good enough to make it through, these games did it for no other reason than just because. To add insult to injury when the RNG wasn't working in their favor. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 video games that punish you for being unlucky. Number 10. The final mission is entirely based on luck. Driver. We all remember Driver's infamously difficult tutorial stage, but if you manage to get past that and all the way till the end, not to worry because there's an incredibly sadistic level waiting there for you too. The last mission, the President's Run, sees the player attempting to protect the President of the United States by driving him to an underground parking lot, while avoiding the combined forces of the NYPD and the FBI. The enemy cars here are extremely fast, durable, and aggressive, which combined with inclement weather conditions make it highly likely your damage meter will be quickly filled up, resulting in a mission failure. But the behavior of your foes is the real kicker here, as it's based on the game's violently unpredictable AI, so your success mostly depends on that. If you're fortunate enough for the rival cars to crash themselves as you speed around, then you might just get the POTUS to safety. On hard difficulty in particular, there's no consistency whatsoever in terms of strategy, and so what wrecks your car in one attempt might actually save your bacon in the next. Add in the seemingly random possibility that you'll skid on the road and flip your car or get T-boned by a civilian vehicle, and the mission's outcome is basically like flipping a coin. Number 9. Party leader dies equals game over. Final Fantasy XIII. In most party-based RPGs, you can expect that the battle will continue unless every single one of your party members is KO'd, and if your main character goes out, not to worry, someone else should be able to res them. But sometimes RPGs defer to a more punishing rule set, whereby the party leader's demise will inexplicably result in a game over, no matter the health of the remaining party, and few games have implemented such a rule as infuriatingly as Final Fantasy XIII. In Square Enix's hit RPG, players have to ensure that the party leader, typically protagonist Lightning, stays alive, which feels like a particularly cruel decision given the propensity for enemies to team up on the player character. But worst of all, numerous enemies throughout the game have instant death attacks, which, while generally possessing a low chance of success, can force players to start the battle from the beginning. This becomes especially frustrating during the final boss battle against Orphan, who has a high chance of casting an instant death attack against you, or in the very least, leaving you vulnerable with incredibly low health. Very few gamers love the party leader dies equals game over rule because it feels so cheap, like an attempt to artificially inflate the game's difficulty and length. Getting punished for a spot of bad luck, especially when the rest of your party stands idly by and relatively healthy, is no fun at all. Number 8. Randomly dying of anything. The Oregon Trail. Legendary educational game The Oregon Trail was designed to teach children about the grim realities of pioneer life, and it absolutely did that. The entire game is centered around the idea that a frontiersman can die at any time for one of many unexpected reasons, through no real fault of their own. If Bad Luck ever had its own video game, it would surely be this one and its various sequels, whereby players and their party of settlers can catch cholera, measles, or typhoid, get bitten by a snake, be devoured by a bear, shot, crushed by a wagon, drowned in a nearby river, or most infamously, succumb to the throes of dysentery. There's rarely a rhyme or reason to any of it. Characters will catch illnesses out of nowhere and die without sentiment. The sequels also introduced the mechanic that if the party leader dies, it's game over. This ruthless approach is of course part and parcel of the game's design, to underline the harshness of 19th century life for American pioneers and how far civilization has come since. Number 7. The Technodrome is hidden in one of 3 tunnels. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The original side-scrolling Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game is well known for its brutal level of difficulty, and while the hatred for the game's infamous dam level is well documented, Shredder's base later on isn't much better. Area 5 tasks players with seeking out the tank-like fortress known as the Technodrome, which is housed somewhere within Shredder's maze-like underground base. The Technodrome is in one of the base's 3 passages, but this is entirely randomized, and there's absolutely no way to tell whether you'll find it the first time, second, or third. As such, it's a complete crapshoot as to whether you'll be able to go in fresh fighting the Technodrome, or whether you'll do so having already explored 2 caves. What's more, one of the caves is filled with considerably tougher enemies than the others, so that one will make the subsequent boss fight even more of a challenge. The Technodrome itself is arguably the hardest boss in the entire game, and for unlucky players who slogged through 3 tunnels in pursuit of it, it does feel a little bit like the game is showing active contempt for their mere desire to be entertained. Number 6. Randomly spawning targets. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. By far the hardest mission in GTA San Andreas is the infamous RC0 level supply lines. Now luckily at least this is an optional mission, but it's still a complete piss take. The mission involves flying an RC plane through San Fierro, shooting up 5 of Zero's rival courier vehicles and returning to his roof all before the plane's scant amount of fuel runs out. The original PS2 version of the game was especially unfair in continuing to whittle away your fuel even if you stopped throttling and tried to glide to conserve fuel, confirming you were really racing the clock above all else. Message boards are full of players who spent hours and hours trying to beat the mission in time, and an underappreciated part of the problem is the fact that the courier's spawn is randomly determined. Now you might get lucky and have 2 of the couriers spawn close to each other, saving you precious seconds. But if you don't, you're damn near condemned to failure, as the couriers will drive too far away from one another for you to destroy them all. Later releases of San Andreas mercifully fixed the fuel issue, such that it only depleted when the player operated the throttle, and in subsequent versions even gave players more fuel to ensure they could get the job done. Again, count yourself lucky that beating supply lines isn't mandatory to complete the game, but it's still a horribly unfair mission that remains hugely controversial and widely loathed almost 20 years later. The recent Definitive Edition didn't do much to change that either. Number 5. The antagonist suddenly showing up and killing you. King's Quest V. Classic adventure game King's Quest V had a hell of a luck-based troll for gamers who managed to make it to the creepy castle lair of villain Mordak. From this point on, it's possible for Mordak to basically randomly materialize in front of the player and promptly force choke them to death, resulting in a game over. There's absolutely nothing that can be done to fight back against Mordak, and to the unassuming player, it seems that there isn't even the faintest trigger for his arrival. While the player can in fact do things to make Mordak's appearance more likely, such as staying in a single room for too long, it's largely an RNG style event, and one which the player is totally helpless to evade once the evil wizard has made his presence felt. The only way to offset this and get past it is, as my dad taught me, save early, save often. Number 4. Unpredictable AI can make the final boss unbeatable. Dragon's Dogma. Dragon's Dogma's true final boss battle is against the Sensual Savan, and while not a particularly difficult fight in and of itself, if the odds aren't in your favor, it can be rendered effectively unwinnable. To beat Savan, you have to either grab him or allow your pawn to land the finishing blow, or let the pawn grab Savan and deliver it yourself. Either way, it is reliant on the AI behaving itself, which, due to a fun programming quirk, it often doesn't. Many players consequently found themselves waiting around for their pawn to actually get involved, which they never did, forcing them to restart the fight. While some players have reported that the pawn may eventually behave if you wait around long enough, the apparent randomness with which the final battle can or cannot be beaten is absolutely infuriating. Number 3. Red's Fake Paintings. Animal Crossing Wild World. Animal Crossing Wild World was the first game in the series where conniving shopkeep Red would try and sell you forged paintings. While later games in the series included subtle differences between the forgeries and real paintings that would tip players off, Wild World offered no such concession, with players instead being encouraged to purchase Lyle's shady forgery insurance to cover their hides. Indeed, it's really just luck of the draw in Wild World as to whether you're getting something legit or not, as there's no way to tell until you've bought a painting and taken it to Blathers, who will be able to deduce its authenticity. Now, admittedly, you can save your game before buying a painting and then reload if it turns out to be a fake, but we're talking sort of mildly irritating busywork that thankfully the series did do away with after this point. Number 2. More to death out of nowhere. Medal of Honor Allied Assault. Much like the Oregon Trail, Medal of Honor Allied Assault uses unforgivingly brutal sudden death to underline the gravity of real history. The iconic FPS features an unforgettable early level set during World War II's Normandy landing on Omaha Beach, basically offering up an interactive version of the mesmerizing opening to Saving Private Ryan. Tellingly, Steven Spielberg co-wrote this game. It's a stunningly cinematic level that's actually held up after 20 years, a mad dash sprint across the beach while trying to avoid German machine gun fire. But the level has one majorly frustrating hidden danger, the random incidence of mortar fire, which, more often than not, will land directly on your position. This occurs enough on lower difficulty settings to be inconvenient, but on hard difficulty it becomes downright maddening. There's no way to tell when a mortar is about to strike your position and instantly kill you, turning it into a pure game of chance where you attempt to dart to safety as fast as possible. PC players then were forced to save scum their way to success here, just incrementally saving every time they made a little bit of progress to try and get to the end. Number 1. Bad weapon drops will ruin your run. FTL Faster Than Light. As an RTS roguelike, FTL Faster Than Light is really meant to be punishing by design, but that doesn't mean players always feel like they're getting a fair shake at it. Your goal is to survive a treacherous trek through a randomly generated galaxy in order to deliver data which will change the tide of an ongoing galactic war. That's certainly easier said than done, especially when we factor in the procedurally generated nature of each new playthrough. Even accepting the inherent luck of the draw though, many players have expressed frustration with some especially unlucky runs, depriving players of even the most basic weapon drops. These weapon-sparse runs will make it near impossible to reach the end of the game, and even if you do get to the final boss, you may well lack the means to take it down. Though FTL certainly isn't a game about instant gratification or a speedy victory, it can become supremely annoying when you're a decent way into a run before you realize you're not going to get any quality weapons, at which point the time has basically been wasted. Such though is the nature of roguelikes and their reliance on RNG. It can be so entertaining but also so frustrating.
Now, what are video games if not blatant wish fulfillment, where we're able to do all of those awesome things that we just can't do in real life or maybe shouldn't? It's an industry built around power fantasies and allowing the player to embody a cool badass hero who does cool badass things, and why the hell not? Yet not all games are so interested in stroking the player's ego, and in fact will punish you for trying to be cool and failing. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 games that punish you for trying to be cool. Number 10. A botched combo loses all your points. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater franchise. What is the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater franchise if not a wish fulfillment exercise for those of us lacking the coordination or flexibility to do trick skating for real? It's a series entirely concerned with looking as rad as possible whilst pulling off death-defyingly acrobatic tricks, which if chained together into an implausibly long combo can net you a colossal number of points. But the game also does not suffer overzealous showboats, as if you decide to keep a trick going past your obvious capability, you'll end up falling flat on your face and pissing all of your accrued points for the trick down the bloody drain. Now this can be infuriating if you've racked up hundreds of thousands of points whilst chaining together dozens of moves, yet because you dared to shoot for the moon rather than banking a sure thing, you ended up paying the humiliating price for it. This is even worse if it happens when playing in front of a friend or live streaming, so make sure you know that you can land that tricky combo before trying to show it off in possibly not quite polite company. Number 9. Dashing makes you trip over. Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Now dashing is a basic aspect of movement in the Super Smash Bros. Series, but beyond that, it also looks pretty damn cool. Too cool for Nintendo apparently, who seemingly felt that peacocking players had to be brought back down to earth in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Now the game contentiously introduced the concept of tripping, whereby players could be forced to trip over due to various attacks, but far worse, there was a 1% chance that a player would also trip up when they performed a dash. Fans expressed near universal disdain for Nintendo's decision to add such an irritating, randomized element into their core gameplay, even if it was done as a misguided attempt to close the skill gap between players. Beyond the obvious issues it created with the competitive scene, which introduced chance into a serious contest, it simply penalized players for doing something as basic yet neat as moving across the ground at quicker speed. Not cool at all, Nintendo. Thankfully, the blowback was severe enough that tripping hasn't ever appeared since. Number 8. Turning into a dragon triggers a game over. Breath of Fire Dragon Quarter. Now, Breath of Fire Dragon Quarter is a textbook example of a game that dangles a bloody awesome ability right in front of your nose, but then teaches you a very nasty lesson if you dare try to use it. The RPG is centered around the D counter, which keeps track of the player's use of the powerful dragon abilities and steadily climbs up to 100%. Much like Mob from Mob Psycho 100, will cause our protagonist to turn into something absolutely amazingly powerful, which sounds amazing, right? Well, wrong, because reaching 100% will suddenly trigger a brutal game over sequence in which our hero is killed when the dragon residing within him violently and explosively bursts out of his body. Though our hero is able to reach 100% later on in the game as part of the story, throughout the core gameplay, it's nothing more than a one-way ticket to a dirt nap. The appeal of going full dragon speaks for itself, so this one feels like an especially maddening punishment. Number 7. Trying to outsmart the barber gets you sent packing. Shenmue 2! God, it's been a while since I've been able to say that. Now, Shenmue, or Shenmue, if we're just going to be boring about it, may be a profoundly goofy enterprise, but that does nothing to undermine the sheer awesomeness of getting to kick ass and take names as our vengeful protagonist, Mr. Hazuki. And while the QTE sequences throughout the franchise typically signal an opportunity to beat the snot out of a street-crawling degenerate, sometimes the right path is something decidedly less less badass. Case in point, during Shenmue 2, the player ends up at a barber shop while seeking out answers. The barber offers to give our hero a trim whilst explaining the particulars of a martial arts discipline, and during their conversation, his body language turns slyly threatening. What's coming out of his mouth, however, is considerably more zen, as he instructs us to remain calm and stay still no matter what happens. At this moment, he pulls a straight razor out to our neck and a QTE prompt appears on screen. Now, players who are conditioned to quickly smash whatever button is prompted most likely hit the button and expected to see our hero beat the hairdresser into a bloody pulp. But if you follow the prompt, he'll catch you off guard and tell him that he's unworthy of learning any techniques before telling him to return when he's found some courage. To rub salt in the wound, the player then has to go home and return to the barbershop the next day to repeat the lesson. Alas, you're actually supposed to just sit there and let the QTE pass without interaction, after which he'll laugh and accept you. Number 6. Lose health every time you use Wolverine's claws. Wolverine on the nares. Now, Wolverine is unquestionably one of the coolest superheroes, and say it with me, kids, of all time! I tell you, I'm getting all of my vocal gimmicks out today. Now, if only Nier Automata Potato was on this list, but alas, it's not. And the selling point of a video game based on Wolverine basically speaks for itself. Who among us wouldn't want to wreak havoc on a never-ending slew of goons with his superhuman strength, healing power, and especially his claws? Well, 1991's Nair's video game sure took an interesting approach to the undeniably coolest and most distinctive aspect of the character, because for reasons that will never make any sense, every time you use the claws to attack, you take damage yourself, whether you connect with an enemy or not. As such, the developers effectively stapled a baffling cost-benefit mechanic to the very ability everybody playing the game wanted to use basically all the time. Though you can just use your fists instead, at that point, is this really a Wolverine game anymore? What's the purpose of punishing players for using a superhero's most defining power? One suspects the developer realized the game was too easy if you use the claws with impunity, and so threw in this awful mechanic into the fray at the last minute. Number 5. Speeding gets you chased by the cops. Mafia. Now, we all know that speeding isn't cool in real life, but in video games, well, it's basically expected in the open-world games like Grand Theft Auto and its glut of "I'll be having some of that as well" clones, which largely don't offer up much of a punishment for players who brazenly decimate the highway code. That is, except for Mafia, which, while certainly one of the better action-adventure sandbox games released in the wake of GTA 3, isn't quite so permissive in the do-whatever-the-hell-you-want stakes. Unlike GTA, Mafia's police are extremely strict when it comes to enforcing the laws of the road. Run a red light or start driving like a maniac without any regard for the safety of others, and you'll soon enough find the popo chasing you down. So much for taking a fun joyride across town without a care in the world, right? In fact, Mafia's cops are so on the ball that the game even has a speed limiter function, ensuring that you can't exceed the speed limit by accident and have to actively turn the feature off. Basically, Mafia isn't the game to take a chaotic tear across town and expect to suffer zero consequences. Number 4. Defeating Bahamut early makes it harder to acquire him later. Final Fantasy III. Now, early on in Final Fantasy III, players will encounter Bahamut in what's designed to be an unwinnable boss battle that results in the player's party being defeated. But not everybody takes impossible odds quite so easily, as some players came to realize that, in the original Nair's version of the game, he could actually be defeated through either relentlessly grinding or glitches. Yet this seemingly phenomenal achievement actually has a rather unfortunate consequence, as because it's not a legitimate victory designed by Square Enix, you won't gain him as a summon, and because you defeated it, you won't get to face it again later in the game as intended. This means that the only way to acquire him is from the secret shop in Eureka, which players may very well not know about. Considering how incredibly useful he is as a summon, you're basically playing yourself if you try to outsmart the game by beating the boss early. Number 3. Punch objects and lose health. Comics Zone. Cult classic beat-em-up Comic Zone is an extremely cool-looking game, set within the panels of a comic book as protagonist Sketch sets to kick and punch his way to salvation. Yet, in a truly bizarre move for basically any video game, Comic Zone doesn't allow you to hit just anything you want for the hell of it. There's actually a bit of a trade-off. You'll encounter obstacles like drums and crates throughout the levels which need to be disposed of, and if you destroy them with your fists or feet, your health bar will also start taking a hit. Now granted, if you actually punched a stack of drums in real life, you'd certainly be in a whole world of pain, but is anyone playing a comic book style beat 'em up also craving a realistic depiction of pain and harm? Not a chance. Players eventually got annoyed enough to release their own ROM hack for emulated versions of the game which removed this feature entirely, in turn allowing them to assault inanimate objects to their heart's content. Number 2. Your moves are copied by your echoes. Echo. Now, Echo came and went in the blink of an eye in 2017, but this indie stealth game sure had one hell of a hook. You see, the game takes place in a gigantic palace which creates copies of the player character for her to fend off. Though you're technically free to do whatever you want movement-wise, the game actively discourages, nay punishes even, those who strut their stuff without a care in the world. And that's because the copies of yourself, called echoes, are periodically uploaded with the player's own actions, which the palace records throughout your gameplay. So if you run, shoot your gun, vault over a wall, open a door and so on, the echoes will be able to perform these actions in the next round, ensuring that the more diverse and dynamic your actions, the more you'll be facing off against them in the next phase. It's a frankly ingenious concept which forced players to think long and hard about every move they made, and yet Echo was sadly a commercial failure despite decent reviews, causing the developer Ultra to close their doors back in 2019. And number 1, being slick nets you a game over. Disco Elysium. Now, Disco Elysium is a delightfully irreverent RPG and one which appears to reward players who think outside the box, but it's also a game with a profoundly dry, snarky sense of humour that clearly relishes putting the player through the ringer if they try to get too cute. Though the central skill check system is relatively forgiving, and the game as a whole embraces the idea of not getting everything right, there are a number of outrageous gotcha fail states which will make short work of anyone who dares to posture. For example, in the opening minutes of the game, if you decide to stay in your pants rather than get dressed and reach for your necktie hanging from the ceiling, becoming the epitome of blasé, I do what I want, chill, right? You'll suffer a sudden heart attack and die. More infamously, later on in the game, you're also able to die from sitting in an especially uncomfortable chair if your health is too low and you fail a skill check, causing another dreaded coronary. As much as Disco Elysium might superficially seem like a super cool slice of detective noir, make no mistake that protagonist Harry is a Hall of Fame level loser, and trying to do anything to the contrary will result in a swift course correction on the game's part.